Section 1. The episodes that were never meant to be found. There is something quietly unsettling about a piece of media that was made, completed, aired, and then removed from existence as though it had never happened at all. Not canceled, not unfinished, not shelved before it could reach an audience. Made, broadcast, watched by millions of people sitting in their living rooms on a weeknight, and then pulled. Quietly, deliberately, and in some cases permanently. The kind of removal that happens without a press release, without a public statement, without any acknowledgement that the thing ever existed in the first place. The Simpsons has been running for over 3 decades, 36 years of Thursday nights and then Sunday nights, of couch gags and chalkboard jokes and opening credits that have become as familiar to most Americans as the sound of their own front door. You could argue, and many people have argued, that The Simpsons is the single most culturally embedded piece of American entertainment ever produced. More people have watched it than have read any single book published in the last 50 years. More people can quote it than can recite any poem, any speech, any piece of canonical literature. It is woven into the fabric of how Americans talk to each other, how they understand irony, how they process the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And yet, inside that enormous archive of nearly 800 episodes, there are gaps, silences, places where the library should have something and finds itself unexpectedly empty. Episodes that aired once and were never seen again. Segments that were filmed and then excised before the episode reached completion. Scripts that were written, revised, approved, voiced, and then quietly set aside because something changed: a relationship, a death, a lawsuit, a conversation between 2 people in a room that nobody else was invited to enter. This is a video about those gaps, about the pieces of The Simpsons that were lost, suppressed, altered, or quietly erased. About what those missing pieces tell us about the show, about the people who made it, and about the strange and sometimes uncomfortable process by which a piece of popular entertainment gets decided before it ever reaches the audience that will eventually consume it without knowing anything was ever removed. Some of what we are going to discuss tonight is well documented. Episodes that were pulled after specific events made their content suddenly inappropriate, situations that the network has discussed publicly, decisions that have been explained in interviews and DVD commentaries, and the kind of retrospective criticism that happens when enough time has passed for people to be honest about what went wrong. Some of it is less certain rumors that circulated in early internet forums, claims made by people who worked on the show and later contradicted themselves, gaps in the record that nobody has ever adequately filled in. The goal tonight is not to alarm you. It is not to convince you of a conspiracy. It is simply to sit with you in the dark while you drift off and tell you about the pieces of this show that most people never think about. The episodes that existed and then stopped existing. The scenes that were filmed and then removed. The stories that were started and never finished. The version of The Simpsons that lives in the spaces between the episodes you have already seen. Settle in. Close your eyes if you want to. Let the sound of this wash over you, because the story of what The Simpsons chose not to show you is, in some ways, more interesting than the story of what it did. The Simpsons began broadcasting on the 17th of December, 1989. That date is well established. It is printed in reference books and cited in academic papers and commemorated every year by fans who treat it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for national holidays. The show debuted with an episode called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, a Christmas special that was originally intended to be the 8th episode of the first season rather than the first. The network moved it to the front of the schedule because they needed a holiday program, and because the originally planned pilot and episode called Some Enchanted Evening was not yet ready. Some Enchanted Evening had problems, significant ones. The animation came back from the Korean studio that had been contracted to produce it, and it was, by most accounts, wrong. Not slightly off, not in need of minor correction, but fundamentally wrong in ways that required extensive and expensive remediation. Character proportions were off, colors were inconsistent, the movement was wooden in a way that made the characters seem less like animated people and more like poorly articulated puppets being dragged through scenes. Showrunner James L. Brooks reportedly watched the footage and felt physically ill. Producer Matt Groening has described the moment of seeing that first batch of animation return as one of the most distressing experiences of his professional life. So the network moved the Christmas special to the front, launched the show, and spent the subsequent months reworking Some Enchanted Evening until it was presentable. When it finally aired as the last episode of Season 1, it was a version of the story that had been substantially revised from what was originally intended. What the original version looked like, what the scenes were before they were corrected and reshot and rebuilt, exists now only in the memories of the people who were in the room when the footage first came back. This is, in a sense, the first lost piece of The Simpsons. The show that premiered in December 1989 was not the show that was originally planned. Something was removed, revised, and replaced before most people ever knew it existed. And this pattern of things being made and then changed, aired and then removed, planned and then quietly abandoned would continue for the next 3.5 decades in ways both small and occasionally very significant. The concept of a lost Simpsons episode has become something of a cultural artifact in its own right. If you spent any significant amount of time on internet forums in the late 1990s and early 2000s, you have probably encountered some version of the creepypasta, the horror fiction genre that presents itself as a true account that centers on a disturbing Simpsons episode that the narrator witnessed under unusual circumstances. These stories tend to follow a familiar template. A person acquires a tape or a file or a disc through some unusual channel. They watch what appears to be a Simpsons episode that is somehow wrong, too dark, too violent, too nihilistic, too honest about something the show normally handles with comedy. The episode ends in a way that is deeply disturbing. The person is left shaken. The tape disappears. No one else can verify what they saw. These stories are fiction. They are exercises in the kind of horror that the internet excels at producing, horror that uses the familiar as a vehicle for the uncanny, that takes something as safe and domestic as a cartoon family and tilts it just slightly until it becomes something threatening. They are not accounts of real episodes that were made and suppressed. But the fact that they exist, the fact that they became a significant and enduring genre of internet horror, tells you something about the relationship between The Simpsons and the concept of the hidden, the removed, the thing that was there and then wasn't. People find it genuinely plausible that The Simpsons might have episodes that were pulled, suppressed, or altered. And the reason they find it plausible is because it has actually happened. Multiple times. In ways that are real and documented and that cast a genuinely interesting light on the process by which the most watched animated show in history decided what its audience was and was not allowed to see. We are going to go through that history tonight. We are going to start at the beginning, with the earliest material, the shorts, the pilots, the test footage that predates the show itself, and move forward through the decades, following the trail of what was made and then unmade, what was aired and then unaired, what was written and then set aside. By the time we are done, the picture that emerges is not of a show engaged in active deception. It is of a show that has, over 36 years of continuous production, accumulated a significant shadow archive alongside its official one. A parallel Simpsons that most viewers have never seen and never thought to look for. That shadow archive is what we are here to explore. The earliest pieces of it predate the show itself by more than 2 years. Before The Simpsons was a half-hour animated series on the Fox network, it was a series of short animated segments produced for The Tracy Ullman Show, a sketch comedy program that Fox aired beginning in 1987. These shorts, there were 48 of them produced over 3 seasons, were the testing ground for everything the show would eventually become. The characters were there. The voices were there, mostly. The relationships were there in rough form. But the animation was cruder than what most people associate with the show, and the tone was different in ways that are interesting to sit with. The Tracy Ullman shorts are not exactly lost. They exist. Copies of them survive. You can watch them if you look in the right places. But they are not officially available in any comprehensive commercial format. They were produced as interstitial content for another show, not as standalone pieces. And the right situation is complicated in ways that have prevented their straightforward release. For most viewers, they exist as a footnote, something that people know about without having actually seen. But within those 48 shorts, there are things that never made it into the main series. Character beats that were tried and then abandoned. Moments of darkness that the show later filed down. A version of Homer Simpson that is, by most accounts, significantly more unpleasant than the Homer that audiences came to love, more selfish, more genuinely cruel, less redeemable in the ways that the full series eventually made him redeemable. The process of transforming those shorts into a viable half-hour series required a significant softening of certain edges. Some of what got softened is visible in retrospect. in the gap between who the characters were in those early interstitial moments and who they became when the show debuted in December 1989. The rest of it, the specific scenes, the specific exchanges, the specific moments that were tried and discarded during the development process exists, if it exists at all, in production archives that most people will never access. This is where the story of the Lost Simpsons really begins. Not with a single dramatic moment of removal or suppression, but with the accumulation of small decisions made during a production process. The gradual editing down of a raw and somewhat ugly thing into the polished and beloved thing that premiered on a Sunday night in December and changed American television forever. What was lost in that process is genuinely worth knowing about. And as we move through the rest of this story tonight, we are going to discover that the pattern established in those early days of making something, and then deciding that some part of it should not be seen, continued right up to the present, in increasingly interesting and occasionally disturbing ways. Take a breath, let your shoulders drop. We are just getting started, and there is a long, quiet night ahead of us to explore everything that The Simpsons made and then decided you should not see. Drop a comment with the time and where you're watching from, and if you're here for the long haul, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this ahead. Number, Section 2. The pilot that almost wasn't the shorts, the test footage, and the earliest version of Springfield. Before Springfield had a zip code, before the power plant had a name, before Homer Simpson had fully become the particular shade of yellow that would eventually be printed on millions of t-shirts and coffee mugs and lunchboxes around the world, there was a much stranger and less finished version of all of it sitting in an editing bay on the Fox lot. The history of how The Simpsons came to exist is reasonably well documented at this point. Matt Groening was called into a meeting with James L. Brooks and asked to pitch an animated series. He had been working on a comic strip called Life in Hell, which featured a cast of rabbit-like characters navigating the anxieties of modern American life. The original plan was to adapt Life in Hell for television. Groening sat in the waiting room outside the meeting room and made a decision. He did not want to sign away the rights to Life in Hell. He liked having it. He liked the control it gave him. So he sat there with a legal pad and invented an entirely new family instead. He named them after his own family. His father was named Homer. His mother was named Margaret. He had sisters named Lisa and Maggie. He gave the son a name that was not his own, Bart, an anagram of brat, a name that felt like it belonged to a kid who would spend his childhood writing things on a chalkboard, and he walked into the meeting with this new family instead of the rabbits. Brooks liked it. The meeting went well. And The Simpsons were commissioned as short animated segments to air between sketches on The Tracey Ullman Show. What most people do not spend much time thinking about is what those early segments actually looked like before they were polished into the version that eventually made it to air. The animation in the broadcast Tracey Ullman shorts is notably rougher than the main series, rougher than most people who didn't watch them remember. The characters are proportioned slightly differently. Homer's head is rounder and his eyes are set closer together. Marge's hair is a similar improbable tower, but the color is slightly off, bluer and less saturated than it would eventually become. Bart has a particular quality of looseness that makes him look like he was drawn quickly, which he probably was, because the turnaround time on those shorts was extremely compressed. But the broadcast shorts, rough as they were already the cleaned-up version. They were already the version that had passed through development and revision, and the particular kind of institutional scrutiny that happens when a network is deciding whether a new property is ready for an audience. There was footage that preceded the broadcast shorts, test footage, development materials, the kind of animation that gets produced when a studio is still figuring out what a character looks like, what their voice sounds like, how they move through the world. Some of this footage is documented in the historical record but has never been publicly released in any complete or official form. The first serious animated test for The Simpsons was produced by a director named Gabor Supo, who would go on to be one of the founding figures of Klasky Supo, the animation studio that produced the Tracey Ullman shorts and the first 3 seasons of the main series. Supo and his colleagues produced a rough animated clip that was intended to show Fox what The Simpsons might look like in motion. By accounts from people who have seen this footage, and not many people have, because it has not been commercially released and the copies that exist are largely institutional, it was quite strange. The characters were recognizable but wrong in ways that are hard to describe precisely. The movement was different. The timing was off. The particular rhythm of how a Simpsons character occupies space, which became so familiar over the subsequent decades that it feels almost natural, was not yet established. This footage exists, presumably in some archive, but it has never been the subject of any official retrospective release, and most fans have only read about it in interviews rather than actually seen it. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The very first moving images of Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa, the very first time these characters existed in animated form, exist in a place that most people cannot access. The beginning of the most watched animated series in television history is, in a technical sense, lost. The Tracy Ullman shorts themselves, the 48 that were actually broadcast, occupy a complicated position in the show's history. They were produced between 1987 and 1989. They were watched by people at the time. They were reviewed, occasionally discussed, and by the time the main series launched in December 1989, they had established enough of an audience that the show could build on existing recognition rather than starting from zero. But they were produced as part of the Tracy Ullman Show, not as standalone pieces, and the right situation that resulted from this arrangement is genuinely tangled. 20th Century Fox owns The Simpsons. But the Tracy Ullman shorts exist within a context that involves Tracy Ullman herself, the production company that made her show, and a web of contractual arrangements that have never been fully untangled in a way that would allow the shorts to be cleanly released as their own commercial product. The result is that 48 animated shorts featuring America's most beloved animated family exist in a state of semi-availability that is genuinely strange for pieces of media this historically significant. You can find them if you look hard enough. They have circulated online. People have uploaded them to various platforms over the years. But there is no official, complete, commercially available release of all 48. They sit in the gap between what exists and what is accessible, which is a kind of lostness, even if it is not total erasure. Within the 48 shorts, the character work is notably different from the main series in ways that are interesting to track. The early Homer is, as noted, less sympathetic than the Homer audiences came to love. There is a specific short in which Homer falls asleep on the couch, and the children take advantage of his unconsciousness to do things he would normally prohibit. The joke works, but the way it works relies on Homer being genuinely useless and somewhat contemptible, a figure of ridicule rather than the warmly flawed everyman he would eventually become. That particular flavor of contempt for Homer softened substantially as the main series developed, and the writers began to find the emotional core of the character. By season 2 or 3 of the main series, Homer was already on his way to being the figure that audiences loved. The version of him in the earliest shorts felt like a rougher prototype. The early Bart is also different. In the shorts, Bart's mischief has a slightly darker quality than it would develop later. He is not simply the lovable troublemaker of the main series. He is meaner, in small ways. His pranks are less playful and more genuinely motivated by a desire to cause distress. This quality was not entirely eliminated from the main series. There are episodes, particularly in the early seasons, where Bart's cruelty has a real edge to it, but it was substantially softened as the show found its tone. Lisa, in the shorts, is closer to the main series version than either Homer or Bart. She is already the intellectual, the outlier, the child who is slightly too aware of the world she is living in. But the emotional complexity that would make her one of the most interesting animated characters on television, the loneliness, the specifically adolescent quality of her idealism, the sense that she is perpetually performing for an audience that is not listening, that would develop more fully once the main series was established, and the writers had more time to explore who she was. Maggie, in the shorts, is mostly a prop. She is present, she sucks her pacifier, she does the things a baby does. The extraordinary inner life that later episodes would attribute to her, the intelligence, the strategic silence, the remarkable competence that she demonstrates when no one is watching, that was nowhere in evidence. Whether it was always the plan for Maggie to be something more than a baby, or whether that development happened organically as writers found themselves looking for things to do with a character who could not talk, is a question that the production history does not fully answer. The Tracy Ullman shorts established the basic vocabulary of the show: the look, the voices, the family dynamic, the Springfield context. But there were things that were tried in those shorts that did not survive into the main series. And figuring out what those things were requires the kind of careful comparison between the two bodies of work that most casual fans have never undertaken. There are shorts in which the family relationships feel different from what the main series established. There are moments of conflict between Marge and Homer that have a sharpness to them that the main series generally avoided. There are interactions between Bart and Lisa that feel less like the affectionate rivalry of the main series, and more like the kind of hostility that can exist between siblings who genuinely do not like each other very much. These are not dramatically different from what the main series would establish. They are shades of difference, tonal variations, the kind of thing you notice only when you watch the two bodies of work in close proximity to each other. But they suggest that the development process involved significant decisions about who these people were going to be and how they were going to relate to each other, and that those decisions were made by eliminating some possibilities in favor of others. What was eliminated is not documented in any systematic way. The people who made those choices, Groening, Brooks, the writers and directors and producers who shaped the show through its development period, have discussed the process in interviews, but not in the kind of comprehensive, exhaustive detail that would let you reconstruct precisely what was tried and discarded. There is also the question of the pilot. The concept of a pilot episode for The Simpsons is complicated because the show's first season contained not a traditional standalone pilot, but rather a Christmas special that was moved to the front of the broadcast schedule for logistical reasons. Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, the episode that aired on the 17th of December 1989, was always intended to be an episode of the show's first season, not a pilot in the traditional sense. But there was a period during development when the show was being prepared for its network launch, and Fox needed some kind of demonstration piece, something to show affiliates, something to pitch to advertisers, something to let the network's internal programming executives actually see what this show was going to be. What that material looked like, whether it constituted anything resembling a produced pilot episode or was simply a collection of development footage, has never been entirely clear from the public record. What is clear is that Some Enchanted Evening, the episode that was originally intended to be the first of the series and was instead pushed to the end of Season 1 after its initial animation was deemed unacceptable, represents the most dramatic example of a piece of Simpsons production history that exists in radically different forms depending on when and where you encountered it. The original animation that came back from the Korean studio is, by all accounts, genuinely alarming. Not horror movie alarming. Production disaster alarming. The kind of animation that makes everyone in the room understand immediately that a significant amount of money has been spent on something that cannot be used. Character designs were inconsistent between scenes. Colors shifted inexplicably. Mouth movements did not sync with dialogue. Backgrounds that should have been stationary moved in ways that made the scenes feel unstable. The network considered pulling the plug on the show entirely at that point. The cost of fixing the animation was substantial. The cost of reanimating it from scratch was even more substantial. The decision to go ahead to spend the money, fix the footage, and launch the series anyway was not inevitable. It was a choice made by specific people under significant financial and institutional pressure, and it was a choice that could have gone differently. If it had gone differently, if Fox had decided the animation could not be saved and the show should be shelved, the original damaged footage from Some Enchanted Evening would have become the entirety of The Simpsons' legacy, a development disaster, a show that tried and failed. A piece of television history remembered, if it was remembered at all, as a cautionary tale about the risks of outsourcing animation production to studios that were not yet equipped to handle the specific demands of the project. Instead, the show was fixed and launched and became the longest-running scripted series in American television history. But the original damaged footage from Some Enchanted Evening still exists, somewhere. It exists in archives. It is not publicly available. It represents the show at its most raw and most vulnerable, the version that almost ended everything before anything began. There is a quality of the near miss about these early production stories that is worth spending time with. The Simpsons that exists, the show that has been running for 36 years, is not the only Simpsons that was possible. It is the one that survived a series of decisions and accidents and disasters and close calls. The animation that almost killed the show in 1989. The network that almost pulled the plug. The meeting where Matt Groening almost pitched a different project entirely. The lost pieces of the show's early history are lost not because someone suppressed them, but because the messy reality of production almost always generates more material than any finished product contains. The gap between what was attempted and what was released is wide in the earliest days of The Simpsons. It narrows as the show develops, and the production process becomes more standardized. But it never entirely closes. And tonight, as we settle in and let the night get quieter around us, we are going to trace that gap from its widest point, the development footage and troubled pilots of the late 1980s, through all the specific moments where pieces of the show were made and then unmade, broadcast and then recalled, planned and then quietly abandoned. The most interesting parts of The Simpsons, it turns out, are sometimes the parts that are not there. Number Section 3. The banned episodes What countries refuse to air and why. Every country that has ever aired The Simpsons has, at some point, decided that a specific episode of The Simpsons should not air in that country. This is not a small or occasional phenomenon. It is a consistent and ongoing feature of how the show has been distributed around the world, and the map of what was allowed where and why tells a surprisingly detailed story about the cultural and political anxieties of the places where the show was broadcast. The United States has its own version of this story, which we will come to. But the international bans are in many ways more revealing, because they expose the assumptions embedded in the show's American context that American viewers have always been too close to notice. When a country bans a Simpsons episode, it is usually because that episode has bumped against something, a religious belief, a political sensitivity, a cultural norm around the representation of certain groups that the show's American writers did not think to consider, or considered and decided was not important enough to change. Let us start in Australia. Australia has a complicated relationship with The Simpsons. The show is enormously popular there, the kind of popular that means it has been on Australian television for almost as long as it has existed, and that Australians of a certain generation grew up with it the same way their American counterparts did. But Australia also has, at various points in the show's history, taken issue with specific episodes in ways that the American network never anticipated. The most discussed Australian case involves an episode, Bart vs. Australia, from Season 6 that is less about banning and more about the specific texture of cultural offense. The episode depicts Australia as a country of aggressively simple-minded people who react with disproportionate fury to a minor misunderstanding involving a prank phone call. The joke is that Australia's legal and cultural institutions are absurdly out of proportion to any actual problem. The entire country apparently mobilizes around Bart, having made a collect call from Springfield to a random Australian kid. The Australian government demands that Bart come to Australia and receive a formal booting as punishment. American diplomatic intervention becomes necessary. The episode is a satire, obviously. It is not a documentary. The Australians in it are as cartoonish as any Americans in any episode of the show. But the reaction in Australia was notable enough that it entered the conversation about how the show represents non-American countries, and it cast a certain light on the episodes that followed. Australia did not officially ban Bart vs. Australia, but the episode generated a level of public conversation in Australia that was unusual for a cartoon, and it established a pattern that would play out in other countries with significantly more serious consequences for the episodes involved. The most significant and sustained ban in the show's international history occurred in Myanmar. In 2007, the military government then in power, the State Peace and Development Council, announced a ban on the importation of any media featuring the colors red and black in combination, on the grounds that these colors had been adopted by a pro-democracy movement that the government was attempting to suppress. This is an extraordinary example of a media ban that has nothing to do with the content of the media itself. The Simpsons was not banned in Myanmar because of anything it said or showed or implied. It was banned because the color of certain characters' clothing happened to align with the visual identity of a political opposition movement. Bart Simpson's red shirt. The particular quality of the contrasting blacks used in the show's animation? These were the problem. The content was irrelevant. This is a kind of censorship that feels almost absurdist, but it is absolutely real, and it illustrates something important about how media bans work at the international level. They are not always about the content. They are sometimes about context, about the accidental alignment between what a piece of media happens to depict and what a political moment happens to have charged with significance. In the Middle East, The Simpsons has navigated a complicated set of cultural expectations that resulted in one of the most dramatic transformations of the show anywhere in the world. When The Simpsons was broadcast in Arab countries, it was not simply translated. It was fundamentally remade. The Arabic version of the show, broadcast under the name Al-Shamshun, relocated the family to an unnamed Arab city. Homer was renamed Omar. He did not drink beer, he drank soda. He did not eat hot dogs, he ate Egyptian beef sausages. Bart was renamed Badr. The family were practicing Muslims. The many references to churches, synagogues, and Christian or Jewish religious practice that appear in the original show were removed or replaced. The result was a show that bore the visual and structural resemblance of The Simpsons while being, in terms of its cultural content, a substantially different product. It was as though someone had taken the architecture of The Simpsons, the family dynamics, the Springfield setting, the episodic structure, and filled it with entirely different furniture. Al-Shamshun ran for 34 episodes before it was cancelled, apparently due to low ratings. Egyptian audiences found it strange and unconvincing, and various critics argued that the transformation had stripped out the very things that made the original show appealing. The humor of The Simpsons is deeply embedded in its American cultural context. The jokes about beer and church and the specific texture of American consumer culture are not decorative, they are load-bearing. Remove them, and what remains is a structural shell without the content that gave it meaning. This is a fascinating piece of the show's international history, but it also represents a kind of loss. The 34 episodes of Al-Shamshun are, in a sense, lost Simpsons episodes. They are episodes of the show that exist in a form that most fans have never seen, and in a cultural context that the show's creators never intended. They are the show and also not the show, simultaneously. They are what happens when a piece of media is adapted so thoroughly for a different cultural context that the question of whether it is the same piece of media anymore becomes genuinely difficult to answer. Japan presents a different case. The Simpsons has always had an unusual relationship with Japanese audiences. The show's humor, its specific brand of American cultural satire, does not translate easily across the particular set of cultural conventions that govern Japanese comedy. Jokes that work because they subvert American expectations about family, authority, and the social contract have to work much harder in a context where those expectations are different. But the Japanese case that is most interesting from the perspective of lost or altered content involves not a ban, but a specific and unusual adaptation. The Japanese broadcast of The Simpsons included, for a period, a set of newly produced interstitial segments featuring the characters in contexts specifically created for Japanese audiences. These segments, brief animated pieces that aired around commercial breaks, were produced with involvement from the Japanese broadcaster and are, by most accounts, not available in any other market. They exist. People in Japan saw them. But they exist as a kind of parallel content stream that fans in other countries have largely never encountered. Small animated pieces of The Simpsons universe, created for one specific audience and then disappearing into the particular distribution channels of Japanese television, where they have not resurfaced in any widely accessible form. China's relationship with The Simpsons is even more complicated and more recent. The episode Goo Goo Gai Pan, which aired in 2005, features a trip to China that includes a brief shot of a Tiananmen Square plaque that omits the historical reference to the events of 1989. The episode was intended as a gentle satire, but the specific inclusion of Tiananmen Square references made it deeply problematic for Chinese broadcast. The episode was not banned outright in China so much as it was never distributed there in the first place, which is a different kind of absence but produces the same result, a piece of the show that a significant portion of the world's audience has never had access to through any official channel. The case of the Italy segment from The Simpsons is worth discussing because it illustrates how a ban can happen not through governmental action but through the quieter mechanism of broadcaster discretion. Various episodes of The Simpsons that touch on Italian culture, Italian-American stereotypes, or references to the mafia have been subject to editorial decisions by Italian broadcasters that resulted in those episodes either not airing or airing in edited form. Italy has a complex relationship with its own representation in American media. The Italian-American identity has been filtered through decades of Hollywood gangster films, through the specific imagery of The Godfather and Goodfellas, and the vast genre of American crime fiction that depicts Italian-Americans primarily through the lens of organized crime. The Simpsons, which regularly deploys those conventions for comic effect, bumped up against Italian sensitivities in ways that resulted in some editorial intervention at the broadcast level. These are not formal bans in the sense of government prohibition. They are the quieter bans of commercial distribution, a broadcaster deciding that a specific episode is more trouble than it is worth, and making the economic calculation that the cost of the controversy outweighs the revenue from the airtime. The result is the same as a formal ban in terms of what audiences see, but the mechanism is different and the documentation is thinner. Brazil deserves mention here because Brazil's relationship with The Simpsons involves one of the most dramatic single incidents of international television controversy in the show's history. The episode Blame It on Lisa, from season 13, features the Simpson family traveling to Brazil for a story that involves slums, kidnapping, and a collection of Brazilian cultural references that Brazilian audiences found offensive in ways that generated a formal diplomatic incident. Brazil's then Minister of Tourism issued a statement criticizing the episode. Brazilian media covered the controversy extensively. The Brazilian tourism industry threatened legal action against Fox, though this did not ultimately proceed to any formal legal proceedings. The episode was broadcast as planned in the United States and in most international markets. But the controversy generated by its Brazilian reception was significant enough that it entered the show's public history as one of the clearest examples of the show's humor, generating genuine and seriously felt offense in the countries it depicted. What is interesting about the Brazilian case is not the controversy itself, but the creative decision-making that led to the episode in the first place. The writers of The Simpsons, asked about the episode in the aftermath of the controversy, indicated that they had not intended the episode as a representation of Brazil generally, but as a satire of a certain American tourist experience. The experience of an American family dropped into an environment they do not understand and cannot navigate. Brazil was the setting, but the joke was about the Americans. The Brazilians, the argument went, had misread the episode's intent. Whether or not that reading is correct, and it is worth noting that it is the kind of defense that is always available to satirists, and is not always entirely convincing. The incident illustrates the particular challenge that The Simpsons faces as a show that has been running for 36 years, and that has, in that time, set stories in virtually every country on Earth. Every country that The Simpsons has depicted has people who live there and who have feelings about how their country is depicted. And those feelings do not always align with the intent of writers working in Los Angeles. The countries that have banned or restricted specific Simpsons episodes across the show's history form a kind of negative map of the show's cultural assumptions. Every ban is a place where the show's default American perspective collided with a context it had not accounted for. Every restriction is evidence of something the show took for granted that the rest of the world did not. Tracking these bans and restrictions across the show's history reveals patterns. Religious content generates restrictions in countries with strong state religious identities. Depictions of specific ethnic groups generate complaints and sometimes bans in the countries associated with those groups. Political content generates problems in countries where the depicted political dynamics touch on sensitive domestic situations. But some of the most interesting restrictions are the ones that do not fit any obvious pattern. The Myanmar color ban is the most extreme example, but there are smaller, less documented cases of episodes being quietly edited or restricted in markets for reasons that have never been fully explained publicly. There are episodes that aired in the United States but that international distributors chose not to license for broadcast in their markets. These are not bans in any formal sense. They are commercial decisions. But they produce the same result episodes that exist in the American version of the show's archive that are missing from the international versions. There are specific scenes within otherwise distributed episodes that were cut by broadcasters for reasons that range from content concerns to simple time constraints. An episode that runs to 22 minutes in its American broadcast might run to 19 minutes on a European broadcaster that allocates less time to the program slot. The 3 minutes that are removed are chosen by the broadcaster, not by the show's producers, and the criteria for choosing what to cut vary by country, by broadcaster, and by the preferences of whatever editor was working that day. These cuts are, in the aggregate, significant. Across hundreds of episodes distributed across dozens of countries over 36 years, the quantity of Simpsons footage that has been cut from international broadcasts is substantial. Most of it has been cut for mundane commercial reasons, but some of it has been cut for content reasons that touch on the show's treatment of religion, ethnicity, politics, and the representation of specific countries and cultures. The result is that there is no single version of The Simpsons that exists uniformly across all its distribution markets. The show that American audiences have watched is not identical to the show that Japanese audiences watched, or Brazilian audiences, or Australian audiences, or any of the other international audiences that have made The Simpsons one of the most globally distributed pieces of American entertainment in history. Every international audience got a slightly different show. Every broadcaster made slightly different choices. And the aggregate of all those different choices produces, across the full international distribution history of The Simpsons, a patchwork of versions and edits and missing pieces that amounts to a substantial shadow archive of the show's international life. Which version is the real Simpsons? The American one, presumably. That is the version the producers made. That is the version that reflects the creative intentions of Groening and Brooks and the writers and directors who have shaped the show for 36 years. But there is a case to be made that the international versions, the edited ones, the adapted ones, the translated ones, the cut-down ones are also real. They are what millions of people actually watched. They are The Simpsons, as it existed in specific places and specific times for specific audiences. The Al Shamshun version is, for the 34 episodes it ran, the version that existed for a specific Arabic-speaking audience. The Japanese interstitial segments are the version that existed for Japanese viewers. The edited European broadcasts are the version that existed for European viewers. The show has many versions, and most of them are partially lost to the general public. They exist in the archives of the broadcasters that made them, or in the memories of the audiences that watch them, or in the small number of recordings that circulate among dedicated fans who track this kind of thing. Tonight, as you settle in and let the details of the show's international distribution history wash over you, it is worth remembering that The Simpsons you grew up with, whatever country you watched it in, was already a version, already an edit, already a set of choices made by people at various points in the distribution chain about what you should and should not see. The question of what was cut, and why, and where it went after it was cut, is a question that the show's official history has never fully answered. The International Archive is a piece of The Simpsons that most fans have never thought to go looking for. But it is real, and it is large, and it contains things that the show's domestic audience has never seen. Number, Section 4, the episodes that were pulled after they aired. There is a specific kind of loss that is harder to process than the loss of something that was never seen. When a piece of media airs, when it is broadcast and watched and discussed and becomes, however briefly, part of the shared cultural experience of its moment and then is subsequently removed from the archive, there is a particular quality of absence that results. The thing existed, people remember it, and then officially it stops existing. The Simpsons has had several episodes pulled from syndication and streaming after their initial broadcast. The reasons for these withdrawals vary. Some were pulled because of their proximity to real-world tragedies that made their content suddenly inappropriate. Some were pulled because of evolving cultural standards around representation that rendered specific scenes or characters problematic in ways that had not been anticipated at the time of production. Some were pulled for reasons that were never fully explained publicly and that remain, in the absence of official clarification, the subject of speculation. The most significant of the episode, withdrawals in terms of cultural impact, occurred in the aftermath of the 11th of September 2001 attacks. 2 episodes of The Simpsons were pulled from the syndication rotation in the days and weeks following the attacks. The first was The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson, which aired originally in 1997 as the premiere of Season 9. The episode features Homer traveling to New York City to retrieve his car, which has been booted on the World Trade Center plaza. The episode includes significant visual attention to the Twin Towers, establishing shots of them, scenes set at their base, the particular visual prominence of the towers in the New York City skyline that defines the episode's backdrop. In the context of September 2001, with the buildings destroyed and the country in acute grief, these images became impossible to broadcast. The episode was pulled from syndication almost immediately and did not return to regular rotation for several years. Even when it did return, individual broadcasters made different decisions about whether to air it at all, and some specifically decided to continue excluding it. This is a complicated case because the episode itself contains nothing that is disrespectful toward New York, toward the World Trade Center, or toward the people who worked or visited there. It is a comedy episode that uses the Twin Towers as a backdrop because, in 1997, the Twin Towers were simply part of the New York City skyline, the most famous buildings in the country's most famous city. They were background, they were context. The episode was not about them. It was about Homer's parking ticket. But context is everything in the aftermath of a tragedy. The images of those buildings, present and intact, and towering over the show's version of a Manhattan street, became something that could not be innocuously consumed. The comedy could not survive its collision with the weight of what had happened. The episode was removed. The second episode pulled after September 11th was New York, New York, which was an episode that similarly featured significant New York City imagery and the Twin Towers in its visual design. The logic of its removal was the same as the first episode, not because of anything deliberately disrespectful in its content, but because of the brutal collision between comedy content and recent tragedy. These are the clearest and most sympathetic cases of episode withdrawal. The reasoning is understandable. The emotional logic is sound. No reasonable person, watching those episodes in the weeks after the attack, could have laughed at the content without the laughter curdling against the imagery of the destroyed buildings. But the withdrawal produced a particular kind of loss. Not the loss of the episodes themselves, which have always been available in one form or another. They still exist, they can still be watched, they have been available on home media. The loss was of their place in the regular broadcast rotation, their easy availability as part of the ongoing flow of syndicated content that keeps The Simpsons constantly present on American television screens. They became episodes that required specific effort to see, rather than episodes that you might come across on a Sunday afternoon while channel surfing. That shift from effortlessly available to specifically sought out is its own kind of absence, even when the underlying content has not been destroyed. A different and more complicated set of withdrawals occurred in 2020, in the context of the cultural reckoning around racial representation that followed the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent global conversation about systemic racism and its expression in popular media. The Simpsons, in common with many long-running shows that had deployed specific representational conventions without adequate examination, found itself facing questions about specific episodes and specific characters. The most significant involved the character of Apu Nahasapi Mapatilan, the Indian-American owner of the Quick E-Mart, who had been a recurring character in the show since its earliest seasons. Apu was voiced by Hank Azaria, a white American actor, doing an accent that critics characterized as a caricature of Indian speech patterns. The character had been the subject of ongoing criticism from South Asian American communities for years, but the conversation reached a significant public threshold in 2017, when comedian Hari Kondabolu released a documentary called The Problem with Apu, which systematically examined the ways in which the character had served as a harmful and reductive representation of South Asian identity. The documentary generated a substantial public conversation. Hank Azaria eventually stepped away from the role in 2020, and the character of Apu became notably less prominent in subsequent episodes. The show issued a statement saying it would make no immediate statement, which was itself a kind of statement. But what about the back catalog? What about the hundreds of episodes in which Apu had appeared, voiced by a white actor doing an Indian accent, deploying a set of stereotyped character traits that the documentary had argued were actively harmful? The show did not pull those episodes from circulation. They remained available in syndication and on streaming platforms. But some streaming platforms made decisions about specific episodes that were deemed particularly egregious in their handling of Apu, or in their handling of other characters of color who had been voiced by white actors using performative accents. The episodes of The Simpsons removed from Disney Plus in this context were Stark Raving Dad, the episode in which Homer is committed to a mental institution and encounters a large white man who believes he is Michael Jackson, was removed by the streaming service. This removal occurred not because of Apu or any racial caricature involving South Asian characters, but at the request of the Jackson estate, which disputed the claim that Michael Jackson himself had voiced the character and objected to the use of his name and imagery in a context they could not control. The episode had been available for decades. It was removed from Disney Plus while being kept from streaming access, though it remained technically part of the show's catalog. The Simpsons also removed 4 episodes from the Disney Plus platform in response to the broader conversation around racial representation. Stark Raving Dad, for the Jackson-related reasons noted. and 3 additional episodes that Disney Plus identified as containing content that did not meet its current standards for racial representation. The specific identities of all 4 episodes have been publicly discussed in the media coverage of the removal, but the framing of their removal by Disney Plus was notable for what it said and what it did not say. Disney Plus stated that they had decided the episodes were best not presented to a current audience in the form in which they were produced. They did not delete the episodes. They did not destroy the masters. The episodes exist, but they became inaccessible through the primary streaming platform through which most people now access the Simpsons catalog, which is a functional removal even if it is not a literal one. This is where the question of what constitutes a lost episode becomes genuinely complex. An episode that exists in a physical archive but is not available for streaming is not lost in the way that a piece of film burned in a studio fire is lost. But it is also not available in the way that an episode in regular rotation is available. It occupies a middle ground existing but inaccessible, present in the official catalog but absent from the daily experience of the show that most audiences have. The removal of Stark Raving Dad is worth spending additional time on because it is the most dramatically significant of the recent episode withdrawals, and because it involves a story that is genuinely complex and genuinely interesting. The episode features Homer being committed to a psychiatric facility after wearing a white shirt to work a nonconformist act that the show's satire frames as evidence of mental instability in a conformist corporation. Culture. At the facility, Homer meets a large white man who calls himself Michael Jackson and who has an extensive knowledge of Jackson's music and performance history. The man claims to be Michael Jackson. Nobody believes him because he is a large white man rather than a black pop star. Homer befriends him anyway. The voice of this character was provided by an actor credited as John J. Smith. The actual identity of the voice actor has been a subject of speculation and claims since the episode aired. Conan O'Brien, who was a writer on the show at the time, has said that Michael Jackson himself recorded the voice, doing it in what O'Brien described as a disguised way, speaking in a slightly different register than his normal voice, to maintain the joke that this might not actually be Michael Jackson. Other accounts have been more equivocal. The official position has shifted over the years. What is not disputed is that the episode, when it aired in 1991, was one of the most watched episodes of the show's early run. It was a cultural event. The question of whether Michael Jackson had actually voiced the character was one of the most discussed questions in American entertainment media for a period after the episode aired. The mystery of it, the sense that something was being concealed, that there was more going on behind the scenes than the credits acknowledged, made the episode additionally compelling. The episode was removed from Disney Plus in the context of the allegations against Michael Jackson that were the subject of the 2019 documentary Leaving Neverland. The Jackson estate's objections to the episode focused on what they described as the unauthorized use of Jackson's image and name in a context they had not approved. The show had made an episode about Michael Jackson, or about a character who claimed to be Michael Jackson, without the kind of formal arrangement that would have given the estate ongoing control over how Jackson was represented. The removal of the episode from streaming is, by any measure, significant. It is an episode that many people remember as one of the highlights of the show's early seasons. It features some of the show's best early writing, and it is now significantly harder to access than the surrounding episodes in the same season. The question of whether these removals constitute censorship, or editorial discretion, or simply commercial decision-making does not have a clean answer. Disney Plus is a commercial platform. It makes commercial decisions. The decision to remove episodes is a commercial decision made by the owners of the platform based on their assessment of what content they want to present to their subscribers. But the effect on the audience is real. Episodes that were once easily available become inaccessible. Pieces of the show's history enter a gray zone of availability, technically extant, but practically absent. The archive is altered, and the experience of watching the show is changed, even for viewers who do not notice the specific episodes missing. There is also the question of what happens over time. Cultural sensitivities change. The reasons that make an episode problematic in one decade may recede in another, or be replaced by different concerns entirely. The episodes pulled after September 11th have gradually returned to broader availability as the immediate grief of that event has given way to a different relationship with the imagery of what was lost. But they spent years in a kind of limbo, and some broadcasters never fully returned them to rotation. Whether the episodes removed in 2020 will follow the same trajectory is genuinely uncertain. The cultural conversations that prompted their removal have not resolved. If anything, they have deepened and become more complex. The question of what to do with historical media that contains content now understood as harmful is a question that cultural institutions are still actively working through, and The Simpsons is not the only property caught in the middle of that ongoing debate. What is certain is that the archive of The Simpsons that a viewer encounters today is not identical to the archive that would have been available at any previous point in the show's history. Episodes have been removed. Others have been edited. The boundaries of what is available shift as the commercial and cultural context shifts around the show. This is the living quality of a long-running series, the sense in which it is never quite fixed, never quite finished, always subject to revision in the context of the present moment. But it also means that the experience of watching The Simpsons is permanently embedded in the specific moment of viewing. What you saw when you watched it in 1995 is not quite the same thing as what you watch when you stream it now. Some pieces are missing. Some have been moved. The archive is living and it changes, and not all the changes are visible to the casual viewer. Section 5. The lost couch gags, alternate endings, and scenes nobody was supposed to see. The couch gag is one of the most distinctive structural elements of The Simpsons. It is part of the opening credits sequence, and it changes with almost every episode. The Simpson family races to the couch. What happens next is different each time. Sometimes the family sits down normally and finds something wrong. Sometimes the couch itself transforms. Sometimes the entire laws of physics bend around the act of sitting down. The couch gag has been used to introduce guest animators, to comment on the plot of the upcoming episode, to do things that have no relationship to anything that follows. It is a space of essentially total creative freedom within the rigid structure of a broadcast television credits sequence, and over 36 seasons it has been used in ways that range from brilliant to baffling to genuinely experimental. There are couch gags that were produced and then not used in any official broadcast capacity. Some of these have leaked online. Some are documented in interviews with the people who made them. Some exist only as references in the production notes that have never been publicly released. The practice of producing more couch gag material than will actually be used in broadcast is not unusual. Animation takes time, and the production timeline for The Simpsons means that couch gags are sometimes produced for episodes and then swapped out at the last minute because a different gag works better, or because a time consideration means the episode needs the credits to run short, or because someone in the room saw the gag and decided it was not quite right. The couch gags that were produced and not used represent a specific category of lost Simpsons content. They are complete. They are finished. They are exactly what they were intended to be. They simply did not make it into broadcast form. The reasons for their non-use are rarely documented publicly, which means that the gap between what was made and what aired is present but largely unexplained. There is also the category of alternate ending scenes that were produced for specific episodes and then cut in favor of a different ending. The most famous documented case of alternate Simpsons endings is the Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery, which we discussed in the framing context of the transcript you provided. A fully produced alternate ending in which Smithers was revealed as the shooter was made, voiced, animated, and finished. It was not the ending that aired, but it exists. That alternate ending was eventually shown on television in a clip show hosted by the character Troy McClure, where it was framed as the ending that didn't happen and dismissed as implausible, but it was shown. It made it to broadcast in the context of a retrospective clip show, which means it occupies the unusual position of being an alternate ending that also became canonical within the show's universe, even though it was explicitly framed as the wrong answer. But the number of alternate endings that were produced and not shown in any context at all is unknown. The production process for an episode of The Simpsons routinely involves writing multiple possible resolutions to a story and choosing between them. Sometimes the choice between endings happens at the script stage, before any animation is produced. Sometimes it happens during the animation process, when seeing a scene moving reveals problems that were not apparent on the page. Sometimes it happens in the editing room, when the rhythm of the episode makes one ending work and another feel off. Every time a choice is made between two possible endings, the ending that was not chosen is, in a technical sense, removed from the archive that the audience will ever access. In most cases, this is not interesting or significant. The discarded ending was discarded because it was worse. The choice was made correctly. The audience got the better version. But there are cases where the discarded ending would have made the episode significantly different, would have changed the meaning of the story, the fate of a character, the emotional weight of what was being said. In those cases, the alternate ending is genuinely interesting, and its loss from the accessible archive is genuinely significant. There are several documented cases of Simpsons episodes in which alternative cuts were produced that changed the episode substantially. These are sometimes referenced in DVD commentaries, where writers and directors will occasionally mention that the episode was originally different, that a scene was cut, or a resolution was changed, or a character made a different choice in an earlier version of the story. The DVD commentaries themselves are an interesting resource in this context because they contain, scattered across the commentary tracks for hundreds of episodes, references to things that were made and then cut. A writer will mention that a scene went long and had to be trimmed. A director will note that a particular joke was tried and didn't work. A producer will describe a different version of a storyline that was abandoned when the episode took a different direction. In aggregate, these references paint a picture of a show that generates significantly more material than makes it to air, not because the production is inefficient, but because the process of making something good necessarily involves making things that are not quite good enough and then removing them. The practice of making deleted scenes that were fully produced but cut from the final broadcast version, became more visible as The Simpsons began releasing DVD collections. The DVD releases of the early seasons included not just the episodes, but also deleted scenes, alternate cuts, and additional commentary that gave fans access to material that had never been broadcast. These DVD extras represent a partial archaeology of the lost Simpsons. They are the pieces of the shadow archive that the production chose to make public, packaged as bonus content for dedicated fans. But the decision about what to include in DVD extras is itself a set of editorial choices. Some deleted scenes were included, others were not. The boundary between what made it onto the DVD and what remained in the production archive is not explained or justified in any systematic way. What made it onto the DVDs is the recoverable deleted scene, the scene that the production decided was worth showing in the context of a retrospective collection. What did not make it onto the DVDs is genuinely lost in a practical sense, even though it presumably still exists somewhere in the archive. There are also scenes that existed in early broadcasts of specific episodes and were later edited out of subsequent airings. This is a less commonly documented phenomenon than episode withdrawals, but it has occurred. As the show has moved from its original broadcast context through decades of syndication and eventually into streaming, specific scenes within episodes have been edited, trimmed, or removed. Some of these edits are driven by time constraints. A scene that could be accommodated in the original broadcast window does not fit in the syndication format, and broadcasters choose to cut it rather than the commercial time. Some are driven by changing content standards. A joke that was acceptable in 1993 generates concerns in 2023, and the path of least resistance is to cut the scene rather than withdraw the episode. Some are driven by reasons that have never been publicly explained. The result is that the version of a specific Simpsons episode that you watch on a streaming platform today may be measurably different from the version that aired in its original broadcast. Not in large, obvious ways. You would not watch an episode and feel that it was fundamentally different from what you remembered. But in small ways, in scenes that ran slightly longer in the original, in jokes that were trimmed or removed, in moments that existed in the broadcast and do not exist in the streaming version. The most commonly cited examples of these content edits involve scenes depicting specific activities that would generate content warnings in a contemporary context, specific kinds of violence, specific kinds of substance use, specific kinds of language. These are cut not because the episodes are being withdrawn, but because the platforms that distribute them apply content standards that are different from the broadcast standards that applied when the episodes were originally made. This ongoing, low-level editing of the archive is in some ways more significant than the dramatic, high-profile episode withdrawals. The withdrawals are visible, they are discussed, fans know when an episode has been pulled. But the quiet editing of specific scenes within otherwise available episodes is largely invisible. You have to be paying close attention, and you have to have seen the original broadcast to notice that something has been removed. Most people are not paying that kind of attention. Most people are watching the show the way you are probably listening to this now, comfortably, in a relaxed state, not actively monitoring for the presence or absence of specific scenes. The edits accumulate invisibly, and the archive changes in ways that most viewers never register. The couch gags that were produced and not used. The alternate endings that were animated and then discarded. The deleted scenes that made it onto DVDs. The deleted scenes that did not. The scenes within episodes that were cut between original broadcast and current streaming availability. All of these together constitute a substantial body of Simpsons material that exists somewhere in production archives, in studio vaults, in the memories of the people who made it, but that the general audience has never accessed and is not likely to access in any systematic way. This is the quiet, mundane version of lost media, not dramatic suppression, not government bans, just the ongoing, unremarkable process of a production generating more material than it uses, and the excess being set aside without ceremony, accumulating in archives that nobody is actively maintaining or presenting to the public. The shadow archive of unused, cut, and altered Simpsons content is enormous. It represents, by any reasonable estimate, a significant fraction of the total material produced by the show across its 36-year run. It is not dramatic. It is not scandalous. It is simply the inevitable result of making a very large amount of content over a very long period of time. But it is there, and if you listen quietly enough, in the spaces between the episodes you can sometimes hear the echo of the scenes that were made and then removed, the jokes that were tried and then set aside, the endings that were animated and then replaced with different endings. The show is larger than what you see when you watch it. It has always been larger than what you see. The pieces you do not see are part of it too, even if you cannot access them directly. Number. Section 6. The celebrity episodes that disappeared after falling outs. The Simpsons has had more celebrity guest appearances than any other show in television history. This is not a modest claim. It is, by most counts, literally true. The show has hosted, across its 36 seasons, hundreds of famous people playing versions of themselves or playing characters created specifically for the episode. Musicians, actors, politicians, athletes, authors, artists, scientists, comedians, and essentially anyone else who was sufficiently famous and sufficiently willing to spend a morning in a recording studio saying lines into a microphone. Some of these celebrity appearances have been among the most memorable moments in the show's history. Some have been less successful, and some have become entangled in controversies, legal disputes, and personal falling outs that have complicated the episode's availability and the show's relationship to the famous people who appeared in them. The most significant case of a celebrity appearance becoming complicated after the fact involves an actor whose relationship with the show became deeply adversarial after what had initially been a friendly and professionally productive association. Phil Hartman first appeared on The Simpsons in Season 2. His first regular character was Lionel Hutz, a spectacularly incompetent personal injury lawyer who became one of the show's most beloved recurring characters. Hutz was followed by Troy McClure, a has-been actor who appeared in innumerable Simpsons parody projects and whose introductory line, "Hi, I'm Troy McClure, you may remember me from," became one of the most quoted and imitated lines in the show's history. Hartman's voice work was essential to both characters, and both characters were essential to the show. Hartman was murdered in May 1998. His wife killed him while he slept and then took her own life. The circumstances of his death were deeply tragic and received enormous attention in the entertainment industry. For The Simpsons, the loss of Hartman was both personal, he was a beloved colleague, and creative. Two major recurring characters were now without voices, and there was no reasonable option for recasting them. The show's response was to retire both Lionel Hutz and Troy McClure. The characters were not killed within the show's universe. They were simply never mentioned again. No replacement actors were hired. No acknowledgement was made within the show of why these characters who had appeared regularly had now stopped appearing. The episodes in which Hutz and McClure appear are all still available. They are part of the show's archive. They were not withdrawn. But they exist in the particular light that falls over all work connected to a tragedy. Watching a Lionel Hutz episode now, the pleasure of Hartman's performance is inseparable from the knowledge of how his life ended. This is not lost content in a formal sense, but it has a quality of loss to it that is different from other episodes. The episodes produced but never aired, in the aftermath of Hartman's death episodes that were in production at the time of his death, and that contained voice performances by him, that had already been recorded occupy an interesting position in the show's history. Some of these recordings were completed by other actors, some were handled in different ways. The specific handling of in-progress Hartman material in the period after his death has not been fully documented publicly, which means there may be pieces of recorded Hartman work sitting in archives that have never been released. A different and more complicated case involves Michael Jackson, whose relationship with The Simpsons we touched on in the previous section and whose removal from the streaming archive was the most significant withdrawal of recent years. The Jackson case is interesting not just because of the removal, but because of what it reveals about the relationship between celebrity appearances and the long-term archive of a show. When a celebrity appears on The Simpsons, the episode becomes, in some sense, about that celebrity as much as about the story it is telling. The audience does not simply hear a famous person voicing a character. They hear a famous person engaging with the fictional world of the show, lending their cultural weight and their particular public persona to whatever is happening in Springfield that week. The celebrity's presence in the episode is inseparable from the cultural meaning of the celebrity at the moment of the appearance. But celebrity culture is not stable. Reputations change. The cultural meaning of a specific famous person in 1991, when an episode was originally produced, is not the same as the cultural meaning of that person in 2021, after decades of additional events have altered how they are understood. The episode does not change, but its meaning changes when the context changes, and sometimes the change in context is significant enough that the original episode becomes unwatchable in the light of subsequent events, not because of anything in the content itself, but because of what has happened to the famous person whose appearance is central to the episode. This is the specific dynamic that made the removal of Stark Raving Dad from Disney Plus both understandable and significant. The episode is a good episode. The performance is a good performance, whoever delivered it. The writing is sharp and emotionally resonant. But the controversy around Jackson's legacy made the episode's presence in the show's streaming archive feel untenable to the people managing that archive, regardless of the quality of the content. There are other celebrity appearances in the show's history where similar dynamics are in play, even if they have not yet resulted in formal withdrawal. Celebrities who have since been accused of serious wrongdoing. Famous people whose public reputations have been substantially damaged by revelations that postdate their Simpsons appearances. The show has run for long enough that the probability that a given celebrity guest has subsequently become controversial approaches certainty. In most of these cases, the show has taken no action. The episodes remain available. The principle that historical content should be viewable in its historical context, whatever has happened since, has generally been applied. But the Jackson case established that there is a threshold at which the controversy around a specific person's legacy becomes sufficient to prompt removal, and the location of that threshold is not clearly defined. This creates genuine uncertainty about the future of specific episodes. Are there other celebrity appearances that may be removed as the conversation around specific individuals continues to evolve? The question cannot be answered in advance, because it depends on events that have not yet happened and cultural conversations that are still in progress. There are also celebrity falling outs that did not result in episode withdrawals, but that did significantly affect the show's relationship with specific performers. Celebrities who appeared on the show and then had disputes with the production that became public. Celebrities who appeared on the show and then, in subsequent interviews, expressed regret about the appearance or criticized the show's use of their appearance. Celebrities who were involved in negotiations about guest appearances that broke down badly and who have since declined to acknowledge the episodes in which they appeared. The show is old enough and has had enough celebrity guest appearances that the population of people who have had complicated relationships with the show after their guest spots is substantial. Most of these complications are minor. A celebrity says something slightly negative in an interview. A production negotiation goes wrong. Someone feels their character was written without adequate input from them. But some of these complications have been significant. Guests who felt their likeness was used in ways they had not consented to. Guests whose appearances generated controversies they had not anticipated and did not appreciate being associated with. Guests who appeared during periods of their careers that they subsequently wished to distance themselves from. The show cannot unair an episode that has already aired. But the streaming era has introduced the possibility of removing or de-emphasizing specific content in ways that approximate unairing. The management of the back catalog on streaming platforms is an ongoing editorial process, and the decisions made within that process have consequences for which pieces of the show's history are readily accessible and which are not. The celebrity dimension of the Lost Simpsons archive is perhaps the most dynamic, because it is the dimension most directly tied to events in the real world that continue to change. The other lost pieces, the development footage, the banned international episodes, the cutscenes are lost because of decisions that were made at a specific moment and are not likely to be revisited. The celebrity-adjacent pieces are lost, or at risk of being lost, because of dynamics that are still in motion, involving people who are still alive and whose reputations and legal situations are still evolving. Somewhere in the show's celebrity archive, there are episodes that exist today in full streaming availability, and that may not exist in that form in 5 or 10 years, because something about the people at the center of those episodes will change. We cannot know in advance which episodes they are. We cannot know in advance what will change. But the precedent has been set. The Jackson removal established that the streaming archive is not permanent. It is subject to ongoing editorial revision. And the criterion for removal is not fixed, it is whatever threshold the platform's decision-makers assess to be appropriate at any given moment. This is the specific quality of uncertainty that makes the celebrity dimension of the show's archive different from the other forms of loss we have been discussing. The other losses are historical. They happened in the past. The celebrity archive is alive, and it is still changing. Number, Section 7. The Treehouse of Horror segments that got cut before they could frighten anyone. Every October, without exception, The Simpsons produces a Treehouse of Horror episode. This has been true since 1990. 34 years of Halloween specials, each one containing 3 segments of horror and dark comedy that operate outside the show's normal continuity, allowing the writers and animators to do things that the regular episodes would never permit. Characters die, Springfield is destroyed, Homer is eaten, the laws of reality dissolve. The show takes the family that it normally protects, the family that always resets, always survives, always ends up back on the couch by the episode's final minute, and puts it through experiences that are genuinely frightening, genuinely violent, genuinely dark in ways that the regular show maintains carefully controlled distance from. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are, in many ways, the most creative pieces of the show's archive. They are where the writers can do things they cannot do anywhere else. They are where the animators can push into visual territory that is closed off in regular episodes. They are where the show most fully explores what it might be if the constraints of its normal format did not apply. And because they are the most creatively unconstrained pieces of the show, they are also the pieces where things most often go wrong, where segments are pushed too far, where jokes land in places the writers had not anticipated, where the combination of horror content and family audience creates tensions that require the segment to be cut before it reaches air. The history of Treehouse of Horror segments that were produced and then cut before broadcast is not thoroughly documented. The production notes for these episodes are not publicly available, and the DVD commentaries for the Halloween specials, while extensive, do not systematically account for all the material that was produced and then discarded. But there are documented cases. There are segments that were written, storyboarded, and in some cases partially animated before being pulled because they were deemed too dark even for a Halloween special. The specific thresholds that apply to Treehouse of Horror episodes are different from those that apply to regular episodes. There is significantly more latitude for violence, for horror, for genuine disturbing content, but there are still thresholds, and segments have run into them. The most commonly referenced category of cut Treehouse of Horror content involves segments where the horror premise generated imagery that was deemed too graphic for the broadcast context. The Simpsons airs in a time slot that is accessible to children, and the Halloween specials, while darker than regular episodes, are not intended as adult horror content. There is a specific kind of violence that the show is not permitted to depict even in the Halloween specials, and segments that pushed into that territory have been pulled. There are also cases of segments that were cut because the horror premise touched on real-world events or cultural contexts that made the comedy uncomfortable. A horror segment that works as pure genre parody can become something else if the genre being parodied connects too directly to something that is happening in the news, something that has recently caused real harm to real people. In those cases, the segment's context can change between production and broadcast in ways that make its content inappropriate. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are produced well in advance of their broadcast date, as all television production is. A segment that was conceived and written and produced in January may air in October, and in the intervening months the world can change in ways that alter what the segment means. A horror premise that was purely fictional in January may resonate too closely with a real tragedy in October. A monster that was a pure cartoon villain in January may look too much like a real person who has committed real crimes by October. In these cases, the choices available to the production are limited. You can cut the segment and replace it with something else. You can edit the segment to change the parts that have become problematic. Or you can delay the episode and broadcast a different Halloween special in its place, bringing the segment out in a subsequent year when enough time has passed. All three of these choices have been made at various points in the show's history, and the documentation of which specific segments were affected is incomplete. There are also Treehouse of Horror segments that were cut because they were not good. This is perhaps the most mundane category of lost content, but it is worth acknowledging because it represents the majority of what gets cut at any stage of any production. Most things that are removed from a piece of media are removed because they are not working, not because they are too dark or too controversial or too politically sensitive. They are removed because someone in the room watched them and concluded that they were not good enough. This category of cut Treehouse of Horror material is the hardest to be nostalgic about, because the quality of what was cut is genuinely uncertain, and the people who cut it did so because they believed the episode was better without it. The assumption that cut content represents something interesting or valuable is not always correct. Sometimes it represents something that was tried and did not work, and its absence from the final product is simply the sign of a functional editorial process doing its job. But within the category of Treehouse of Horror segments that were cut because they were not good, there are almost certainly pieces that were not good in interesting ways. Experiments that failed, but that failed in directions worth knowing about. Dark premises that were pushed too far, not in the sense of being too violent or too offensive, but in the sense of being too honest, too strange, too genuinely unsettling for the format in which they were being attempted. These are the kind of cuts that are interesting to imagine, even if the actual footage would not necessarily be satisfying to watch. The Treehouse of Horror episodes also generate a substantial amount of material in the form of segments that were conceived but never produced. Writers' rooms for the Halloween specials are particularly generative, because the freedom of the format encourages the kind of speculative, boundary-pushing thinking that the regular episodes do not. Pitches are made for segments that will never be animated. Premises are explored that are immediately recognized as either unbroadcastable or unworkable. Scripts are written for segments that get to a certain stage of development and then stall when it becomes clear that the premise cannot be executed in a way that makes the final episode better. This category of never-produced Treehouse of Horror content is the most speculative. We know it exists because writers have occasionally described it in interviews recounting a pitch that was made and rejected, or a script that was written and then set aside. But the details are fragmentary, and constructing a comprehensive account of what was pitched and never produced for the Halloween specials is not possible from the available public record. What we can say is that the Treehouse of Horror episodes, as impressive as they are in their accumulated form across 34 years, represent only a portion of the horror and dark comedy that was attempted in the show's production history. The segments that made it to broadcast are the segments that survived a development process that involved substantial generation of content that was subsequently discarded. The shadow archive of the Halloween specials is larger than most people realize, and it contains, almost certainly, things that would be genuinely interesting to see, not because they are better than what was broadcast, but because they reveal the extent of what was attempted and the nature of the choices that were made about what the audience should and should not be allowed to encounter. The Treehouse of Horror has always operated on the premise that there is a place within The Simpsons for things that are too dark for the regular show. The segments that were cut before broadcast reveal the existence of a further category, things that were too dark even for the dark show within the show. That category is small, but it is real, and it tells you something about the outer limits of what the show's creators thought they could or should put on television. In the quiet of this particular night, with the Halloween specials rolling around in your mind, it is worth sitting with the thought that somewhere in the archive there are horror stories that The Simpsons started to tell and then stopped, premises that were built and then abandoned, monsters that were designed and voiced and began to move through Springfield before someone made the decision to pull them back. They are waiting in archives you cannot access, in the dark parts of the production history that never make it into the DVD special features or the podcast interview retrospectives. And if you could watch them, some of them might be genuinely frightening. Not because they are professionally produced horror, but because they are the things that the people who make The Simpsons decided were too much, and that judgment is its own kind of revelation about what the show thinks is possible. Section 8. The scripts that were written and abandoned storylines that never became episodes. The most invisible category of lost Simpsons content is not animation that was produced and cut or episodes that were broadcast and removed. It is the scripts. The fully written, often multiply revised, occasionally table read and voice recorded scripts that were abandoned before they ever became animation. Every season of The Simpsons begins with a writer's room generating more story ideas than will ever become episodes. The show produces approximately 22 episodes per season. The writer's room may develop 40 or 50 story ideas in the course of a season's planning process. Some of those ideas get written into outlines. Some of the outlines get written into scripts. Some of the scripts get revised and sent to production. Some do not. The scripts that do not make it to production are, in a strict sense, the most lost pieces of the show's history. Animation that was produced exists as physical material frames of film, digital files, voice recordings. Scripts that were abandoned often exist only as documents in production archives that the public will never have access to. And if those documents are not actively preserved and maintained, they may not exist at all. The volume of abandoned Simpsons scripts across 36 seasons is enormous. The writer's room has never been particularly selective at the idea generation stage. The process is designed to generate quantity and then to narrow down to quality through successive stages of development. The ratio of ideas to finished episodes is probably something like 3 or 4 to 1 at the conceptual stage, narrowing through successive rounds of development to perhaps 2 to 1 by the script stage. If those numbers are approximately correct, then for the approximately 800 episodes that have been broadcast, there are probably something like 800 additional scripts or partial scripts or story outlines that were abandoned at some point in the development process. That is a substantial parallel archive of story material. What is in those scripts? That question cannot be answered from the available public record. Writers and producers have described specific abandoned storylines in interviews, but these descriptions are fragmentary and not comprehensive. They tell us about specific cases but do not give us a systematic account of what the abandonment archive contains. What we know is that some abandoned storylines were abandoned because they were not good. The story did not work, the ending was not there, the premise was interesting, but the execution was unachievable within the show's format or budget or production constraints. These are the majority of abandoned scripts, and their abandonment is simply the normal function of a healthy development process. But some abandoned storylines were abandoned for reasons that are more interesting. Storylines that were too dark, storylines that were too politically sensitive, storylines that touched on events that happened between the writing of the script and the window when the episode would have been broadcast. Storylines that were killed by a change in circumstances, a real-world event that made the fictional premise suddenly inappropriate, or a change in the show's creative direction that made the story feel like it belonged to a different version of the show. There are documented cases of storylines that reached the script stage and were abandoned after real-world events overtook them. An episode written as satire of a political situation that had not yet fully developed in the real world, which then did develop to a point that made the satire either too obvious or too disturbing to broadcast as comedy. An episode that included a fictional disaster that was subsequently echoed by a real disaster in ways that made broadcasting the fictional version inappropriate. The show has been running for so long and has covered so much American cultural territory that the probability of a real-world event making a specific piece of scripted content unbroadcastable has been quite high throughout its run. There is almost certainly a segment of the abandoned script archive that consists of episodes that were killed not by creative failure, but by the awkward timing of their fictional premises intersecting with real events. There are also storylines that were abandoned because of creative disagreements between the show's writers and producers and the network. Fox has had specific content requirements for The Simpsons that have varied across the show's history and that have not always aligned with what the writers wanted to do. Scripts that pushed too hard against network content standards were not necessarily broadcast, they were revised, sometimes beyond recognition, or abandoned entirely. The most publicly documented case of this kind of creative friction involves the show's treatment of religion. The Simpsons has, across its run, depicted God, depicted heaven, depicted hell, depicted prayer, depicted religious faith and religious doubt in ways that range from sympathetic to satirical. Fox has, at various points, had concerns about the show's treatment of specific religious subjects, and there are documented cases of network intervention in story content around religious themes. The extent to which this intervention affected abandoned scripts, specifically whether there are scripts that were written and killed because of network religious content concerns rather than revised and modified, is not clearly established in the public record. But the presence of ongoing friction between the show's creative team and the network around this issue suggests that abandonment was probably one of the available outcomes when a story hit a content wall that revision could not resolve. There are also storylines that were abandoned because of cast and crew considerations. A story that required a guest performer who declined to participate. A story that centered on a recurring character whose voice actor was unavailable or who had died. A story that was structured around a real-world cultural phenomenon that had already passed by the time the episode would have aired. The show's long production timeline means that episodes are produced 6 to 12 months before they broadcast. A storyline that is relevant and timely in January may feel dated or disconnected by October. The show tries to manage this problem by building stories around cultural constants rather than momentary trends, but it does not always succeed. And there are almost certainly abandoned scripts that fell victim to being too precisely tied to a cultural moment that had passed. The specific case of abandoned storylines about technology deserves attention. The Simpsons has always incorporated technology into its stories, but the rate of technological change in the real world has been faster than the show's production cycle can easily accommodate. Stories that were pitched in a specific technological moment may be set in an obsolete technological context by the time they would be broadcast. The specific details of smartphones, social media, streaming, and other contemporary technologies that define the current moment have changed fast enough that stories built around specific technological situations can feel dated within the span of a single production cycle. There are writers for the show who have described abandoning specific stories because the technology they were built around had already changed significantly between the writing and the projected broadcast window. These are small losses in themselves, individual episodes that were abandoned because the timing was wrong. But in aggregate, they point to a specific challenge that long-running scripted television faces in the contemporary technological moment. The world is changing faster than the production cycle can accommodate. There are also the storylines that were never written but that were extensively discussed in the writer's room. The ideas that were pitched, debated, and ultimately not pursued, not because they were clearly bad but because the room could not solve the story problem that they presented, or because the moment in the season schedule did not allow for them, or because they seemed right for later and later never came. These are the most ephemeral pieces of the lost Simpsons archive. They exist only in the memories of the people who were in the room when they were discussed. They were never written down in any form that would allow them to be recovered. They live, if they live at all, in whatever a former Simpsons writer can remember about a conversation that happened 20 years ago in a room in Los Angeles. The writer's room of The Simpsons has been populated over 36 years by some of the most talented comedy writers of their generation. The ideas that were discussed in those rooms and then not pursued, the stories that were almost told, the characters that were almost created, the Springfield that almost had different contours are, in some sense, the deepest lost piece of the show's history. You cannot recover a conversation that happened in a room. You can only listen to the people who were in it describe what was said. And even those descriptions are fragmentary, filtered through decades of time and the inevitable distortions of memory. The abandoned scripts, the killed storylines, the never-pursued ideas, these are the dark matter of the Simpsons universe. They don't appear when you look at the show directly, but they are there, exerting their influence on the shape of what you see, defining by their absence the specific contours of the show that exists. Section 9. The International Edits. How different countries got a different show. We discussed in an earlier section the countries that banned specific episodes of The Simpsons outright. But outright banning is actually the least common form of international content alteration. Far more common and far less visible to international audiences is the practice of editing, adjusting, trimming, replacing specific content with different content, localizing not just the language but the substance of what the show says. The Simpsons has been dubbed into dozens of languages. This is a basic logistical necessity for a show distributed as widely as The Simpsons has been. But dubbing is never a purely neutral translation process. When you translate a script from English into French, or into Spanish, or into German, you are making choices that go beyond the simple substitution of equivalent words. You are making choices about meaning, about tone, about the specific cultural context that a joke requires in order to function. A joke that depends on an American cultural reference has to be either kept in its original form, requiring international audiences to understand the reference, or adapted into an equivalent local reference, requiring the translators to find something that functions similarly in the target culture, or simply replaced with a different joke that does not depend on the original reference at all. All three of these approaches have been used in different markets and in different episodes of The Simpsons. The result is that the dubbed versions of The Simpsons in many languages are not simply translations of the original. They are adaptations, in some cases significant ones, that reflect the judgments of localization teams about what will and will not work in specific cultural contexts. The German dubbing of The Simpsons is one of the most extensively documented cases of localized content alteration. The German dub, which began in 1991 and has continued through the show's entire run, made a series of early decisions about how to handle the show's specifically American humor that resulted in a version of the show that German fans describe as notably different in tone from the American original. The German dub of Homer Simpson, in particular, was for many years voiced in a way that made the character somewhat less sympathetic and somewhat more aggressive than the American version. The voice performance changed specific dynamics in the character, made Homer feel different in small ways that accumulated across the episodes into a meaningfully different character. Some of the cultural references in the German dub were substituted with German equivalents. American television shows that Homer watches were replaced with German television programs. American brands were replaced with German ones where possible. The specific texture of American consumer culture that runs through the show was in some cases replaced with a corresponding German texture. These are not dramatic changes in terms of the story content. The plots of the episodes remain the same. The characters are in the same situations, making the same general decisions. But the specific cultural atmosphere of the show is different, and the cumulative effect over many episodes is a version of The Simpsons that German audiences experienced as somewhat different from what American audiences experienced, even though they watched the same episodes. The Spanish-language dubbing of The Simpsons presents a different set of challenges because the Spanish-speaking world is not a single cultural market. The same episode, dubbed into Spanish for broadcast in Spain, requires different choices than the same episode dubbed into Spanish for broadcast in Mexico or Argentina or Colombia or any of the other Spanish-speaking countries where the show has aired. Cultural references that work in one Spanish-speaking context do not necessarily work in another. The humor of the show is shaped by specific contexts that vary significantly across the Spanish-speaking world. The result is that there are, in some tonatical, multiple Spanish-language versions of the same episode versions that were produced for different markets and that reflect the different cultural contexts of those markets. These versions are not always accessible to people outside the specific market they were produced for, which means that the Spanish-speaking audience for The Simpsons is not a single unified audience, but a collection of audiences, each of which had access to a slightly different version of the show. The French dubbing of The Simpsons has its own particular history. France's relationship with American popular culture is complicated by the country's long-standing cultural protectionist policies, which include specific regulations about the proportion of French content that must air on French television. The Simpsons has navigated this regulatory context by being treated as a sufficiently localized product through dubbing and cultural adaptation to count toward French content quotas in ways that the original English-language version would not. The adaptation process for the French market involved cultural choices that are visible in the dubbed version. Specific American references were adapted into French equivalents. The show's representation of food, which is significant given Homer's relationship with eating, was adjusted in ways that reflect French cultural attitudes toward food that differ from American ones. The references to fast food that run through the original show were handled differently in the French dub, where fast food carries different cultural weight than it does in the United States. The Japanese dubbing of The Simpsons represents perhaps the most extreme case of cultural adaptation in the show's international distribution. Japan's cultural context is sufficiently different from the American one that the translation challenges faced by the Japanese localization team were substantially greater than those faced in most European markets. The specific conventions of Japanese comedy, the cultural assumptions embedded in Japanese family dynamics, the particular relationship that Japanese culture has with the conventions of American suburban life, all of these differences created challenges for a localization process that needed to make the show accessible and funny to Japanese audiences without losing what made the show distinctively itself. The choices made in the Japanese localization were, according to accounts from people familiar with both versions, significant. Not in terms of story content, the plots were the same, but in terms of the comedic texture, the specific jokes, the cultural references. The Japanese audience got a show that was recognizably The Simpsons, but that existed in a specifically Japanese cultural register. This process of cultural adaptation is not unique to The Simpsons. Every piece of American media that is internationally distributed goes through some version of this process. But the specific case of The Simpsons is worth dwelling on because the show's humor is so deeply embedded in American cultural assumptions that the adaptation challenges are unusually significant. The show's satire of American consumer culture, American family life, American political dysfunction, and American suburban existence is not easily portable to cultural contexts where those specific features of American life are not understood or not shared. The jokes depend on recognition on the audience sharing the cultural knowledge that the show is satirizing. In contexts where that cultural knowledge is less available, the jokes require either explanation or replacement, and both of those options alter the fundamental nature of what the show is doing. There are specific episodes of The Simpsons where the cultural localization challenge is so significant that the international versions are dramatically different experiences from the American original. Episodes that center on specifically American cultural phenomena, the Super Bowl, specific American holidays, American political processes present particular challenges for localization, and the solutions adopted by different international distributors produce results that vary significantly from the American version. The international editions of The Simpsons represent, in aggregate, a substantial body of adapted and altered content that most viewers have never considered. The show that was experienced in Germany in 1992 was not the same show that was experienced in Japan in 1992, or in Brazil, or in Australia. They were all versions of the show, shaped by the same original production, but filtered through localization processes that produced meaningfully different results. These international versions are, in a real sense, lost to most viewers. The German-dubbed version of a specific episode from 1992 may not be available anywhere outside of German broadcast archives. The Japanese localized version may not be accessible outside of Japan. The Spanish versions produced for specific Latin American markets may exist only in those markets' broadcast records. The accumulated archive of international versions of The Simpsons is enormous, and most of it is inaccessible to anyone who did not happen to be in the right country at the right time to watch the specific version that was broadcast there. Number. Section 10. The episodes where something went wrong during production. There is a quality to production disasters that is different from any other kind of lost or altered content. When something goes wrong during the making of an episode, when the animation is wrong, or the story falls apart at a late stage, or a recording session produces unusable material, or a creative decision is made and then regretted before the episode is complete, the resulting episode is a hybrid object. It is both the episode it was intended to be and the evidence of the things that went wrong while it was being made. Some of the most interesting episodes in The Simpsons archive are the ones that bear the visible marks of something having gone wrong. Not the episodes where everything went smoothly and the result was a polished and satisfying piece of television. The episodes where the production hit a wall, where something broke, where the show was forced to solve a problem it had not anticipated, and the solution it found is visible in the final product. The most famous case is, of course, Some Enchanted Evening, the episode whose animation problems we discussed in an earlier section. That episode made it to air as the final episode of the first season, substantially reworked from its original form. The episode that broadcast was not the episode that was originally produced. It was a corrected version, a recovered version, a version that bore the marks of a significant production emergency that had required enormous investment to resolve. The marks are visible to anyone who watches the episode knowing what to look for. The animation is somewhat uneven in ways that suggest different parts of the episode were worked on at different times by different teams working to different standards. Some sequences look notably more polished than others. The joins between the recovered and unreconstructed parts of the episode are not seamless. This is not a criticism of the episode. which is actually quite good. It is simply an observation about the production history and about what becomes visible in the final product when you know the history of how it was made. Some Enchanted Evening is the most documented production disaster in the show's history because it happened at the very beginning, when the show was new and the stakes were high, and the people involved later wanted to tell the story of how close the whole thing came to ending before it began. But production problems happened throughout the show's run, and most of them were not documented as thoroughly, because they happened in the middle of a long-running production that had established rhythms for handling problems as they arose. The nature of the problems changed as the show's production methods evolved. The early seasons were produced using traditional hand-drawn animation, with frames painted on cel by artists in studios in both the United States and in Korea. The specific problems that this production method generates are well documented in the industry quality control challenges across multiple studios. Consistency issues with character design, the specific challenges of maintaining visual continuity when different parts of an episode are produced by different teams. As the show transitioned to digital production methods in the early 2000s, the nature of the production problems changed. The specific problems of cel animation, inconsistent coloring, off-model character designs, the visible evidence of multiple studios working to different standards were replaced by different problems. The challenges of digital animation are different from those of hand-drawn animation, and the episodes from the transition period carry the marks of a production that was finding its way in a new technical environment. There are specific episodes from the early 2000s where the transition to digital production is visible in the final product. Episodes that were begun in one production environment and finished in another. Episodes where the visual style shifts in ways that reflect the production shifting from one method to the other. These are not lost episodes, but they are episodes where the production history has left visible marks on the final product. The writing process generates its own category of production problems. An episode that was conceived with one story and produced with a different story. An episode where the story broke at a late stage and had to be substantially rebuilt under time pressure. An episode where a subplot was added late to fill time that had been created by cutting another scene. And the addition is visible in the rhythm of the episode. The pacing feels slightly off. The story feels like it has one more moving part than it needs. The DVD commentaries for The Simpsons provide, in aggregate, a substantial account of specific episodes that experienced production problems. Writers and directors will describe episodes where the story did not come together until very late in the production process, where the ending was being written while the beginning was being animated, where the final version of the episode was significantly different from the version that was originally planned. These descriptions are fascinating pieces of production history, but they are also limited in what they reveal. The people making the commentaries are describing their memories of a production process that happened years or sometimes decades before the commentary was recorded. The details are filtered through the distorting lens of retrospection. What they remember about what went wrong, and what they are willing to say on record about it, may not be the complete account of the specific production problem. There are episodes where something went wrong in the voice recording that affected the final product in ways that the production could not fully resolve. Voice performances that were unusable for reasons of quality, or because the actor's delivery did not match the animation that had already been produced, or because the actor had given a performance that was right for the script as written, but wrong for the episode as it evolved through the production process. In these cases, the solutions available were limited. Re-record the performance if possible, reanimate the scenes if necessary, or find an editing solution that worked around the problem. Most of these problems were solved in ways that were invisible to the audience. The show had a production apparatus sophisticated enough to handle most of what went wrong. But there are episodes where the solution to a production problem left a visible mark, a moment that feels slightly off, an exchange that doesn't quite land, a scene that appears to be doing less than it was originally intended to do. These are not lost episodes. They are episodes that survived their production problems and made it to air. But they carry within them the evidence of something that went wrong and was compensated for, rather than simply resolved. They are the places where the archive contains not just the episode but the ghost of a different episode that was being made until something happened and the production had to change direction. The ghost episodes, the versions of shows that were being made until a production problem redirected them, are the most elusive pieces of the lost archive. They are not material that can be recovered from a production vault because they were never fully produced in the form they were heading toward. They are the potential versions of the show, the things it was becoming before something intervened. You can hear them sometimes, if you know what to listen for, in the way an episode hesitates at a specific moment, or resolves too quickly, or includes a scene that seems to be doing work that is not quite justified by the rest of the story. These are the moments where the production history becomes briefly visible through the polished surface of the final product, where the ghost of the alternative episode makes itself felt in the slight imperfection of the episode that exists. Number. Section 11. The final mystery: what the lost episodes tell us about the show we think we know. We have spent a long time in the Shadow Archive. We have moved through development footage and troubled pilots, through international bans and cultural adaptations, through pulled episodes and cutscenes, through abandoned scripts and production disasters. We have traced the perimeter of The Simpsons that most people have never seen. The large and largely invisible body of material that surrounds the show, you know? And now we have arrived at the question that all of this history points toward. What does it mean? What does the existence of this Shadow Archive tell us about the show that we have been watching for 36 years? The first thing it tells us is that The Simpsons, like all long-running media, is not a fixed object. It is a process. It is a continuous making and unmaking of something. A daily negotiation between what was intended and what is possible, between what the writers wanted to say and what the network would allow, between what was produced and what the audience was permitted to see. The show that exists is not simply the show that was made. It is the show that survived the pieces that made it through the development process, through production, through the network's content review, through the decisions of international broadcasters, through the changing cultural and political contexts of 3.5 decades. Every episode that exists is an episode that outlasted all the reasons it might not have existed. This is not a unique quality of The Simpsons. It is the nature of any piece of mass media produced within a complex institutional context. The show exists within a system, a network, a production company, a distribution apparatus, a legal and commercial infrastructure, and the show's content is shaped at every stage by the constraints and pressures and decisions of that system. What is unique about The Simpsons is the scale and duration of this process. 36 years, nearly 800 episodes, dozens of countries, hundreds of international distribution arrangements, thousands of creative decisions made by hundreds of people over the course of what is now, genuinely, most of a human lifetime. At that scale, the Shadow Archive is not an anomaly. It is an inevitability. The things that were made and not used, the episodes that were pulled and not returned, the scripts that were written and abandoned, the segments that were cut, the alternate versions that were produced and not broadcast, all of these are simply the natural residue of a production process running at scale over a long period of time. But the Shadow Archive is also meaningful in a specific way that goes beyond being a natural byproduct of production. It is meaningful because the choices that constitute it, the choices about what to include and what to exclude, what to broadcast and what to pull, what to allow and what to restrict, are not arbitrary. They are the accumulated expression of judgments made by specific people in specific institutional contexts about what The Simpsons should be. The show that exists is the show that someone decided you should see. The Shadow Archive is the show that someone decided you should not see. And the gap between the two, the space between the available archive and the Shadow Archive, is the space where you can read, if you look carefully, the outlines of what the show considered off-limits, unacceptable, too dark, too political, too culturally specific, too risky. The international bans tell you where the show's American assumptions were most visible and most foreign. The pulled episodes tell you where the collision between fiction and reality was most acute. The cutscenes tell you what the show could imagine but could not broadcast. The abandoned scripts tell you what stories were attempted and found unfinishable. The production disasters tell you where the process of making the show was most vulnerable to failure. Read together. These pieces of the Shadow Archive constitute a kind of negative image of the show, a map of what The Simpsons was not, which illuminates, by contrast, the specific choices that made it what it is. The show has always been, at its core, about the gap between what American life promises and what it delivers. About the specific quality of American experience that involves living inside a system that is simultaneously familiar and dysfunctional, comfortable and constraining, beloved and bewildering. The family on the couch, watching television, in a house in a town that doesn't quite exist, living lives that are recognizable without being real. The Shadow Archive is the show engaging in the same dynamic about itself. It is The Simpsons, encountering the gap between what it wanted to be and what it was permitted to be. Between the show the writers imagined and the show that made it through the system to the audience. Between the Springfield they could envision and the Springfield they could broadcast. Every piece of the Shadow Archive is evidence of that gap. And the gap is not a flaw, it is a feature. It is the show being honest about the conditions of its own existence, about being a piece of mass media produced within constraints that are never fully visible to the audience consuming the final product. The lost episodes do not reveal a secret conspiracy behind The Simpsons. They do not prove that the show has been deliberately suppressing important truths. What they reveal is something more ordinary and more interesting. They reveal the show as a process rather than a product. A continuous act of making and unmaking, deciding and revising, reaching towards something and then pulling back when the reach extends too far. The Springfield, you know, the one with the nuclear plant and the courthouse and the Quickie Mart and the Simpson house on Evergreen Terrace, is the Springfield that survived all the decisions that could have made it different. It is the Springfield that emerged from a production process that cut, revised, withdrew, and adapted its way to the specific version of the show that became one of the most watched pieces of entertainment in human history. And somewhere outside the visible edges of that Springfield, in the archives and the vaults and the memories of the people who made it, there is a larger Springfield, a stranger and more various and more complicated Springfield. The Springfield of the abandoned scripts and the cut scenes and the pulled episodes and the international alternatives and the banned segments and the production disasters. That Springfield is lost. It is not recoverable in any complete sense. The pieces of it that exist are scattered and inaccessible and often undocumented. The pieces that do not exist, the conversations in writers' rooms, the creative directions that were considered and discarded, the stories that were told partway and then stopped are genuinely gone. But the shape of it is there, in the negative space around the show you know. You can trace its outlines by looking at what is present and imagining what is missing. By watching the episodes you have access to and listening for the places where the production history is briefly visible. By reading the DVD commentaries and the interviews and the retrospective accounts of people who were in the room when decisions were made, and hearing in those accounts the echo of all the decisions that went the other way. The Lost Simpsons is the Simpsons that was possible but not produced, attempted but not finished, broadcast but not preserved, preserved but not available. It is the show's relationship with its own potential, its own limits, its own ongoing negotiation with what it is and is not permitted to be. And it is in some ways the most interesting version of the show. Not because the lost pieces are better than what was broadcast, most of them probably are not, but because the existence of the lost pieces reveals the process by which the show became itself, the choices, the constraints, the accidents, the disasters, the cultural collisions, the institutional pressures that shaped each episode from conception to completion. The Simpsons is, when you look at it in this way, a series of decisions. Thousands of them, made over 36 years by hundreds of people, each one shaping the show in ways small and large. The decisions that resulted in the episodes you have seen are the visible ones. The decisions that resulted in the episodes you have not seen, the scenes you have not watched, the stories that were attempted and not completed, are the invisible ones. But all of them are part of the show. The visible archive and the shadow archive together constitute the full Simpsons, the enormous, complicated, endlessly various body of work that the show has generated across its entire history. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let the shadow archive be present alongside the episodes you know. Let the awareness of what is missing exist alongside your memory of what is there. Not as an anxiety, not as a sense that something has been taken from you, but simply as a recognition of the size of the thing. The Simpsons is larger than you can watch. It is larger than you can know. It extends in every direction, backward into development history, outward into international versions, sideways into abandoned alternatives, inward into the production history that shaped each episode from the inside. And most of that larger Simpsons is lost. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, just quietly, in the specific way that things get lost when a lot of people make a lot of decisions over a very long period of time, and most of the decisions leave no trace that anyone outside the room can recover. The Lost Simpsons is not a mystery to be solved. It is simply the inevitable shadow that a show of this size and duration casts behind it as it moves through time. The episodes you cannot see, the scenes you did not watch, the stories that were started and not finished. The Springfield that could have been, in all the parallel universes where the decisions went differently, that Springfield is quiet now. If it ever made any noise, the noise has faded. What remains is the Springfield you know, the one that survived, the one that made it through, the one that is still running, still broadcasting, still generating new episodes and new couch gags and new reasons to sit down on a Sunday night and go home. That Springfield is enough. It has always been enough. The family on the couch, the town with the cracked cooling towers, the children who never age, the father who always finds his way home. But the shadow Springfield is there too, in the dark outside the edges of the picture. The episodes that were made and pulled, the scripts that were written and abandoned, the scenes that were filmed and cut, the stories that were started and stopped, they are there, in the archives, in the memories, in the small quiet spaces between the episodes you know. And if you listen carefully enough, on a night like this, when everything has gotten very still and the television is a long way away and the only thing in the air is the sound of a story being told in the dark, you might just be able to hear them. The lost episodes. The Shadow Springfield. The Simpsons that was possible but not broadcast. Attempted but not completed. Made but not preserved. All the ways the show could have been, surrounding the show that it is. Good night. Sleep well. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point. Number, appendix. Additional lore, the strange details nobody talks about. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight, but there are pieces of the lost Simpsons archive that do not fit neatly into any of the categories we have discussed. Small mysteries, persistent rumors, documented oddities that deserve attention even if they do not rise to the level of a full section on their own. Consider for a moment the episode that aired in a different form in different regions of the United States in the same broadcast cycle. The Simpsons, like all network television, is produced as a national broadcast. The same episode airs at the same time, with adjustment for time zones across the entire country. But the economics of television syndication have occasionally created situations where local broadcasters aired different versions of the same episode, or aired episodes in different sequences, or made last-minute substitutions that resulted in one region of the country seeing something different from what another region saw. These discrepancies are small. They are mostly undocumented, but they are real, and they point to the fact that even within the domestic American broadcast of the show, the audience's experience was not entirely uniform. There is also the matter of the episodes that were produced in double versions, a version for the original broadcast and a revised version for subsequent airings, reflecting small changes made between the initial broadcast and the syndication of the episode. These changes are often very small, a line of dialogue re-recorded to correct a mistake, a visual detail corrected in the digital master, a piece of music replaced because the original license had lapsed. But they mean that the version of an episode that aired in its original broadcast week may be measurably different from the version that airs today when the episode is in syndication or streaming. The music licensing issue deserves specific attention. The Simpsons has, across its run, used a vast amount of licensed music. Songs that were cleared for the original broadcast may not have had their licenses renewed for subsequent airings, or for home media release, or for streaming. When a license lapses and cannot be renegotiated, the music has to be replaced. The replacement is usually something with a similar feel, a piece of music that serves the same function in the scene, but it is not the original. There are episodes in The Simpsons archive where the music in the streaming version is demonstrably different from the music in the original broadcast. Fans who have compared the two versions have documented specific substitutions. A joke that depended on the specific meaning or recognition value of a particular song may land differently with a substitute piece of music. A scene that was emotionally calibrated to a specific piece of licensed music may feel slightly off with a replacement. These are small losses, but they are real ones, and they accumulate across nearly 800 episodes over 36 years into a substantial body of small differences between the show as it was originally broadcast and the show as it is currently available. The licensing issue also affects the home media releases. Episodes released on DVD in specific years reflect the music licenses that were current at the time of the DVD release. Subsequent streaming releases may reflect different licenses, because the rights situation for streaming is different from the rights situation for home media, which means that the version of an episode on a DVD may be different from the version of the same episode on a streaming platform. The fan community that tracks these differences, that watches episodes side by side, that documents the specific changes between versions, that maintains archives of the original broadcasts for comparison with current versions is small but dedicated. The documentation they have produced is one of the most detailed accounts available of how the Simpsons archive has changed over time. Their work is a form of archaeology. They are digging through layers of versions and releases and platform-specific edits to find the original object underneath. And what they find, consistently, is that the original object is not quite the same as the current available version. The archive has changed. The show is not fixed. The version you watch today is not identical to the version that aired. This is not a conspiracy. It is not suppression. It is simply the ordinary life of a piece of long-running media in the modern world of digital distribution, streaming rights, and the ongoing renegotiation of commercial arrangements between production companies, rights holders, and platforms. But it is worth knowing. It is worth sitting with the knowledge that The Simpsons you have access to is a version 1 specific set of choices about what music to use, what scenes to include, what content to make available on which platforms. It is not the definitive Simpsons. There is no definitive Simpsons. There are versions, each slightly different, each reflecting the specific moment and context of its production or re-release. The show you know is real. It is the real Simpsons. But it is also partial. It is also incomplete. It is also surrounded by all the versions and alternatives and lost pieces that constitute the shadow archive we have been exploring tonight. And that is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about a piece of media that has been running for 36 years. It is larger than what you can access. It is stranger than what you know. It contains more than it shows you. And the more you look at what is missing, the more interesting the whole thing becomes. The Lost Simpsons is not separate from the Simpsons you love. It is part of it. It is the part you cannot see, pressing against the part you can, shaping the edges of the visible archive through the specific pressure of its absence. Feel that pressure now. Let it be present as you close your eyes. As the story winds down, as Springfield gets quieter and darker and the lights in the houses on Evergreen Terrace go out one by one. Somewhere in the archive, the lost episodes are waiting. The pulled scenes, the abandoned scripts, the alternative versions, the international editions, the production disasters, the celebrity falling outs, the cultural bans, the small everyday decisions about what the audience should and should not see that accumulated over 36 years into the specific Simpsons that exists. They are all there, quiet, mostly inaccessible, mostly unrecoverable. The shadow Springfield, dark and still outside the edges of the picture. Sleep now. Springfield will be there in the morning. The couch, the family, the couch gag that changes every week. The town that doesn't appear on any map but that you could find with your eyes closed because you have been there so many times that it is, in some specific sense, home. Home where the archive is always waiting, where the episodes are always cycling, where Homer is always stumbling through the door at the end of the day, and Bart is always writing something on the chalkboard, and Lisa is always playing her saxophone, and Maggie is always watching everything with those enormous knowing eyes. The show that never ends. In the town that isn't anywhere. Running forever on a loop that started in 1989 and has never quite stopped. Good night, Springfield. Good night. Number. Section 12. The character who was almost written out and the ones who almost were written in. One of the more quietly fascinating threads running through the production history of The Simpsons is the question of which characters almost didn't make it. Not in the sense of nearly being killed within the show's fiction, though that too has happened and we will come to it. But in the developmental sense, characters who existed in early drafts of the show's world and were then removed before the audience ever met them, and characters who were never quite created, who existed as a type or a function within the writer's room's imagining of Springfield, but who never coalesced into a fully realized person with a name and a face and a voice. Every long-running show accumulates this kind of shadow population. The characters who were written into scripts and then cut when the episode was edited down. The types that were discussed in the writer's room as potential recurring figures and never made it past the conceptual stage. The specific named characters who appeared in 1 or 2 episodes and were then quietly never mentioned again, not because they died within the show's fiction, but because no subsequent episode found a use for them. Springfield's population is, by any reasonable count, enormous. The main series features a core family and a well-established supporting cast, But around that core, there are hundreds of named and semi-named Springfield residents who have appeared once or twice, or occasionally throughout specific seasons, and who then fade into the background. These are real characters. They have designs, they have voices, they have the specific texture of existence that animation confers, but they are also marginal, present in the archive without being present in the show's regular life. The most interesting cases are the ones where the marginalization happened by decision rather than by simple narrative neglect. Characters who were conceived as potential recurring figures, who were introduced with the specific intention of giving them a regular role in the show's universe, and who then didn't take, whose introduction did not generate the kind of audience or creative energy that would justify their regular inclusion. The show's writers and producers have described this process in various interviews, the experience of introducing a character and then discovering that the character doesn't work in the way it was hoped, that the specific combination of traits and situation and voice that was assembled does not add up to something that the show finds generative. The character is available, the writers could use them, but they keep finding that the stories they want to tell do not require this character, and the character gradually stops appearing. This is a natural process in the life of any fictional universe. Not every character that is created finds their place in the ongoing story. Some are created specifically for a single episode and their role is complete when the episode ends. Some are created with larger ambitions in mind, but find that those ambitions are not realized. Some are created in response to a specific creative need that turns out to be temporary, and when the need passes, the character has no other function. But within this entirely normal process of character creation and attrition, there are cases that are more deliberate. Characters who were created and then actively decided against. Characters whose potential was recognized and then consciously set aside. Characters who were removed not because the show forgot about them, but because a specific decision was made that they should not continue. The most dramatic case of this kind involves characters created for specific seasons who were subsequently written out in ways that the audience did not always notice. The writer's room for a long-running show occasionally makes decisions to reduce the presence of specific characters, not because those characters are killed within the show's fiction, but simply because the show stops using them. The character is still alive in Springfield, by every canonical implication. They are simply not present in any episodes that subsequently air. From the audience's perspective, these characters simply stop appearing. There is no death, no departure, no explanation. The character who appeared regularly in one season is simply absent in subsequent seasons, and unless the audience is paying very close attention, the absence may not even be noticed. From the production's perspective, these absences are the result of specific decisions about where to invest the creative energy of the writer's room. Every episode can only contain a limited number of characters and storylines. Including a specific character in an episode means not including something else. The decision to stop using a character is, in this sense, a decision about what the show wants to be, what kinds of stories it wants to tell, what kinds of people it wants to spend time with. The character of Frank Grimes, introduced in the episode Homer's Enemy in the 8th season, is one of the most dramatic cases of a character who was used once and then specifically not brought back, not because of any production failure, but because of a conscious creative decision about what the character represented and what his presence in subsequent episodes would do to the show's equilibrium. Frank Grimes, known to fans as Grimy, is in many ways the most deliberately constructed character in the show's history. He was designed specifically to be the character who sees Springfield as a viewer from outside, might see it as a place where the rules of effort and reward and basic logic do not apply, where Homer Simpson can be catastrophically incompetent and yet be rewarded rather than punished, where the social order systematically advantages the undeserving while punishing those who work hard and follow the rules. The episode is extraordinary. It is one of the show's most critically discussed pieces of work precisely because it is doing something different from what the show normally does. It is introducing a perspective that sees Springfield clearly, that names what Springfield is, that refuses the warm comedy that normally surrounds even the show's most dysfunctional elements, and insists instead on the genuine absurdity, the genuine unfairness of the world Homer inhabits. Grimes cannot survive in Springfield because Springfield is defined partly by its willingness to accept Homer. The comedy of Springfield depends on a kind of foundational absurdity, a willingness to extend to Homer a grace that he has not earned and that a system organized around merit would never extend to him. Grimes, who cannot extend that grace, who insists on seeing Homer clearly and responding to him accordingly, is destroyed by the collision between his own insistence on meaning and the Springfield universe's fundamental indifference to meaning. The episode ends with Grimes's death and, in one of the most devastating jokes in the series, with the mourners at his funeral laughing at one of Homer's accidental pratfalls rather than mourning the person they have ostensibly gathered to remember. Springfield absorbs Grimes's death the way it absorbs everything, without consequence, without lasting change. The decision not to bring Grimes back to let the episode stand as a single, self-contained confrontation between the show's internal logic and an external perspective that refuses to accept that logic was a specific creative choice. Writers have described the thinking behind it. Bringing Grimes back would require either continuing to punish him, which would make the show uncomfortable in ways that would not serve it well, or finding a way to integrate him into Springfield, which would require abandoning the specific quality of his outsider perspective that made the episode work. The ghost of Frank Grimes, the character who saw Springfield clearly and was destroyed by it, haunts certain discussions of the show's later seasons. Episodes in that later period where the show seems to lose its grip on the specific quality of Homer's character, where the comedy of his incompetence tips into something less comfortable, sometimes feel like they are circling the Grimes problem without acknowledging it. The question of how to respond to Homer with the warm acceptance that the show's emotional core requires, or with the clear-eyed assessment that basic logic would produce, is a question that the Grimes episode raised and left open. The characters who almost made it into Springfield's regular cast, who were developed to the point of having specific designs and voice actors attached and storylines planned, are a less visible piece of the shadow archive, but they are real. Every season's development process involves the conception of new characters, some of whom make it into episodes and some of whom do not. The ones who do not make it exist as designs in production archives, as descriptions in development notes, as names in writer's room documents that were never turned into animation. What would Springfield look like if the characters who almost made it had made it? The question cannot be answered, because the characters who almost made it are largely undocumented in the public record. Their designs and names and the storylines that were planned for them are in archives that the public does not access. But they exist, in that shadow form, as part of the larger population of Springfield that was imagined and not rendered. There is also the question of the characters who were created for specific episodes and whose specific creation involved choices that changed what those episodes were. Every character in every episode is the result of a design process. Someone had to decide what that character looked like, how they spoke, what specific personality traits they embodied. The choices that were made in those design processes produced specific characters. Different choices would have produced different characters. The specific Frank Grimes, who appeared in Homer's Enemy, is the result of all the design choices that were made. A different set of choices would have produced a different character and a different episode. The Shadow Grimes, the character who might have been if different design choices had been made, is part of the Shadow Archive in the most abstract sense. Not a piece of footage that exists somewhere in a vault, but a possibility that was present at the moment of creation and then foreclosed by the specific choices that were made. The ghost of the character who almost was, surrounding the character who is. This is the nature of creative decision-making at its most fundamental. Every specific choice forecloses other specific choices. Every character who exists does so at the cost of the characters who could have existed instead. The Springfield, that is the product of all the choices that were made against all the other possible Springfields. The archive of those other possible Springfields is not recoverable. It exists only as a theoretical space, the space of everything that was possible before the specific choices were made that produced the show we know. But it is a real space, and its existence gives the specific choices that were made a weight that they would not otherwise have. Springfield is not the only possible Springfield. It is the Springfield that was chosen. From among all the Springfields that were possible, and knowing that feeling, the weight of all the other Springfields pressing against the edges of the one that exists, changes how the existing Springfield feels. It feels specific, chosen, particular, in the precise philosophical sense of the word, the one that was picked from among many. Number, Section 13. When the show predicted its own history, the meta-episodes and self-reference. The Simpsons has, across its run, produced a significant number of episodes that are about the show itself. Episodes that reflect on the show's own history, its own conventions, its own place in the culture. Episodes that break the frame in specific ways, acknowledging that the family exists within a television show and playing with the implications of that acknowledgement. Episodes that are, in various ways, about the experience of watching The Simpsons. These meta-episodes represent a specific kind of lost content in a way that is different from the other categories we have discussed. They are not lost in the sense of being unavailable or suppressed. Most of them are available, but they contain within them references to things that are not available to the show's own history, to its own internal mythology, to events and decisions and pieces of production history that are part of the shadow archive rather than the official one. When the show references its own history within an episode, it creates a specific kind of recursive situation. The episode, which is itself part of the archive, is pointing at other parts of the archive, including parts that are not accessible. It is drawing a map that includes territories that do not appear on any other map. The clip show episodes are the most obvious examples of this dynamic. The Simpsons has produced a significant number of clip shows episodes that consist primarily of footage from previous episodes, framed by a thin narrative wrapper. These episodes are, by the standards of critics and most fans, among the least artistically ambitious pieces of work the show has produced. They are the show recycling its own material, which is the most transparent possible acknowledgement that the show's archive exists and that the archive is being commercially exploited. But clip shows do something else that is more interesting than they are usually given credit for. They create a specific relationship between the current episode and the episodes it references. They select specific moments from the archive and present them as the archive's representative pieces, the clips that best stand in for what the show is, what it has done, what it means. The selection process for clip shows is itself a set of editorial decisions about the archive. Which moments are chosen to represent the show's history? Which jokes are repeated? Which character beats are held up as exemplary? These choices reveal something about how the show understands its own history, what it considers its high points, what it thinks the audience most values, what moments it believes have the most to offer when extracted from their original context and presented as standalone pieces. The moments that are not chosen for clip shows are also significant. The clips that never appear in clip show episodes, the moments that are somehow always not quite representative enough, not quite perfect enough, not quite what the production reaches for when it is assembling a retrospective. These are, in a sense, the clip show's shadow archive, the archive of the archive. But the more interesting meta-episodes are the ones that are not simply clip shows, the episodes that engage with the show's own history and mythology in more inventive ways. The episodes that tell stories about the process of making The Simpsons, or that comment on the show's cultural position, or that acknowledge the specific weirdness of being a show that has been running for as long as The Simpsons has been running. The episode Itchy and Scratchy and Marge, from the second season, is an early and important example. The episode uses the fictional show within the show Itchy and Scratchy, the ultra-violent cartoon that Bart and Lisa watch to explore questions about censorship, about the relationship between entertainment and behavior, about the specific dynamics of public pressure campaigns against entertainment media. Marge objects to the violence in Itchy and Scratchy and campaigns against it. She succeeds. The cartoon is changed. And then, when the same pressure group that supported Marge's campaign against cartoon violence targets Michelangelo's David as inappropriate public art, Marge finds herself on the other side of the argument. The episode is, among other things, about the show itself. It is about the specific kind of cultural scrutiny that The Simpsons attracted in its early years, when it was genuinely controversial, when parents' groups and school boards and cultural commentators were debating whether the show was an appropriate piece of entertainment for children, whether its irreverence was harmful, whether Homer's various failures as a husband and father were modeling behavior that children would imitate. The Simpsons navigated that scrutiny. It survived it. It became, over time, so culturally established that the idea of it being controversial seems strange in retrospect. But the early years of the show were genuinely contested, and the show's response to that contestation, its willingness to engage with the arguments against it, to take the concerns seriously while ultimately rejecting them, is part of its history that does not always receive the attention it deserves. Within the meta-episodes, there are moments that reference things that are not otherwise available in the official archive. References to the Tracy Ullman shorts. References to the development history of specific characters. References to production decisions that were made in ways that altered the show. These references are not always explicit, they are sometimes coded, sometimes embedded in jokes that work on one level for casual viewers, and on another level for fans who know the production history well enough to recognize what is being pointed at. The most interesting meta-episode from the perspective of the Shadow Archive is the 138th episode Spectacular, technically titled The Simpsons 138th Episode Spectacular, which aired in December 1995 and consists of Troy McClure hosting a retrospective of the show's history, including the alternate ending to the Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery that we discussed in an earlier section. The episode is fascinating because it is simultaneously a clip show and a piece of meta-commentary on the show's relationship with its own history. The Troy McClure framing allows the episode to be self-aware about what a retrospective clip show is and what it is for the commercial exploitation of the archive, the invitation to nostalgia, the specific pleasure of seeing clips from episodes that the audience remembers, and finding that memory confirmed or complicated by seeing the clip again. But the episode also contains, within the Troy McClure framing, a set of disclosures about the show's production history that are presented as revelatory information, things the audience did not know, being shared as part of the retrospective package. The alternate Burns shooting ending is the most significant of these disclosures, but there are others, references to character development decisions, to the origins of specific Springfield residents, to the production history of specific memorable episodes. These disclosures are presented within the Troy McClure framing with a quality of controlled revelation. The show is choosing what to tell the audience about its own history. It is selecting specific pieces of the behind-the-scenes story to share while leaving other pieces unshared. The 138th episode Spectacular is, in this sense, an official partial account of the Shadow Archive, the pieces of the production history that the show has decided to make public, embedded in an entertainment frame that makes the disclosure pleasurable rather than exposing. The pieces that were not disclosed in the 138th episode Spectacular, the production history that the show chose not to share in that context, are the Shadow Archive of the meta-episode. The behind-the-scenes information that exists but was not included in the official retrospective. The production decisions that the show knows about and has not chosen to make public. Every retrospective is, in this sense, a set of editorial choices about the archive. The 138th episode Spectacular chose certain things to include and not others. Those choices reveal something about how the show understood its own history at that moment, what it was comfortable disclosing, what it wanted to emphasize, what it preferred to leave in the shadow. The self-referential episodes that followed across subsequent seasons have continued this dynamic. Episodes that comment on the show's own longevity, on the floating timeline, on the specific strangeness of being a show that has been running for so long that its characters exist in a permanent present tense while the world around them changes. These episodes are engaging with something real about the show's situation, and they are doing it from within the show itself, which creates a specific and interesting recursive quality. The show that comments on its own longevity is the show that is still running because it has survived for a very long time. The characters who make jokes about not aging are the characters who have been the same age for decades. The show that references its own archive is the show that has produced that archive and that continues to add to it with each new episode. Within this recursive self-reference, there are moments that point specifically at the Shadow Archive, at the things the show has made and set aside, the decisions that have shaped it, the gaps in the official record that only the people who made it can fully account for. These moments are not always obvious. They require a knowledge of the production history that most viewers do not have. But they are there, embedded in the meta-episodes as a kind of private acknowledgement from the production to the fans, who are paying close enough attention to notice. The show has always known about its own Shadow Archive. It has always known about the episodes that were pulled, the scripts that were abandoned, the characters that almost existed, the alternate versions that were produced and not broadcast. It knows because the people who made it made all of those things, and they carry the knowledge of them. The meta-episodes are, in part, the show's way of acknowledging that knowledge, of letting some of it surface into the official archive, in the controlled and entertaining form of a retrospective or a self-referential joke, of recognizing the Shadow Archive without fully exposing it, of winking at the people who know enough to understand what the wink means. Number, Section 14. The guest voices you never heard, recordings that didn't make it. Beyond the famous cases of celebrity appearances that were broadcast and then pulled, There exists a quieter category of lost Simpsons audio, the recordings that were made and never used. Voice sessions that happened, with real actors delivering real performances into real microphones in real studios, that for one reason or another did not make it into the episodes they were recorded for. Voice recording for an animated show happens long before the animation is complete. Actors come in at the script stage, often months before the episode will air, and they record their lines based on what the script says and what the director tells them. The animation is then produced to match the recorded audio rather than the other way around. This means that the voice recording is the first completed element of an episode, the thing that exists before anything else is finished. It also means that the voice recording is the element most vulnerable to being superseded by subsequent changes. If the story changes after the recording has been made, the recording may no longer fit the story. If an actor delivers a performance that works on the page but not in the context of the finished episode, the performance may need to be replaced. If something changes about the relationship between the production and the person whose voice is in the recording may become unusable for reasons that have nothing to do with the quality of the performance. In all of these cases, the original recording exists, it was made, in a physical or digital form that persists, but it is not used in the final episode. It joins the shadow archive as a piece of audio that was produced and set aside. The most commonly referenced type of this problem is the re-record the situation where an actor comes in and records lines that are then revised when the script changes, and the actor has to come back and record the new version. In these cases, both recordings exist, the original version and the revised version. The original version was used during the production period before the change was made and then superseded. The revised version is what appears in the final episode. The original recordings in these cases are not simply unusable takes, they are completed performances of specific lines that were, at the time they were recorded, the intended lines for the episode. They represent a version of the episode that was in production at a specific moment and that was then revised. They are audio evidence of the episode's development history, of the specific moment in production when the story was different from what it eventually became. These recordings are almost certainly preserved in the production archive, as any professional production would preserve its original session tapes or digital audio files. But they are not accessible to the public, and they are not the sort of thing that tends to be discussed in interviews or DVD commentaries, unless something specifically notable happened in the session. The more interesting cases are the ones where a performance was recorded by a specific actor and then not used because the actor's involvement in the episode was canceled, or because the production relationship changed, or because the specific recording that was made did not work in the context of the finished episode in a way that could be addressed by simply recording the lines again. There are accounts in the show's production history of recording sessions that did not produce usable material for reasons that went beyond the specific quality of any individual take. Sessions where the creative direction was wrong and the performance being asked for was not the performance that the episode needed. Sessions where the director and the actor were working from different understandings of what the character required. Sessions where the material being recorded revealed problems with the script that had not been apparent on the page. In these cases, the result was sometimes a complete reapproach to the episode, a revision of the script, a rethinking of the character, a different direction for the recording when the actor came back in. The original session remains in the archive as a record of the approach that did not work, surrounded by the revised material that replaced it. The specific celebrity guest recording sessions that did not produce broadcast material are the most interesting of these cases, because they involve famous people whose participation in the show was presumably known in certain circles even if it never became public. A celebrity who came in to record for a Simpsons episode and whose performance was not used for whatever reason is a piece of information that exists in the production record, but that is not publicly documented. The people who were in the recording studio for these sessions know who was there and what was recorded. The production archive contains the audio of what was recorded. But unless someone from the production has discussed it in an interview, or unless the recording itself has somehow leaked, the existence of these recordings is not publicly known. What celebrity voices are sitting in the production archive, unaired, representing guest appearances that were recorded but never broadcast? The answer to that question is not available from the public record, but the probability that the answer is non-zero is high across 36 seasons of an extremely celebrity-friendly show that has had hundreds of guest appearances. The probability that every celebrity recording session produced material that was used exactly as intended in the final episode seems low. There are also the voice actors, the regular cast, the recurring guest cast, the people who have contributed to the show's voice ensemble across its history, whose work on specific episodes may exist in forms that were not used in the broadcast version. Dan Castellaneta, Yeardley Smith, Nancy Cartwright, Julie Kavner, Hank Azaria, Harry Shearer across decades of recording sessions for hundreds of episodes. The quantity of recorded material that was not ultimately used in any broadcast episode is substantial, even before you add the celebrity guest material. The cast of The Simpsons has been remarkably consistent across the show's history. The core voice cast has been largely the same since the beginning, with specific exceptions around specific characters where the voice actor relationship ended or changed. But even within that consistent cast, the specific performances that were recorded and then set aside, the alternate takes, the revised recordings, the sessions that were later superseded by re-records, represent a significant body of audio that exists in the archive without having been heard by the show's audience. This audio archive is, in a specific sense, the most intimate piece of the Shadow Archive. It is the voice actors doing their work in the specific unglamorous reality of a recording studio, making choices about how to perform lines that may or may not make it into the final episode. It is the show at its most unguarded before the animation, before the editing, before the specific alchemy that turns a set of individual performances into a finished episode. If you could listen to the full production audio archive of The Simpsons, all the session tapes, all the original recordings, all the alternate takes and revised performances and abandoned sessions, you would be hearing the show as it was before it was the show. You would be hearing the raw material, the human voices making choices about who these characters are and how they speak, the specific moments of performance that the production process would eventually select or discard. That archive is enormous. It is not public. It is probably not comprehensively cataloged in any form that would allow easy navigation. It is the audio shadow of the Shadow Archive, the material that exists at the earliest stage of the production process, before most of the decisions about what the episode will finally be have been made. And somewhere within it, sitting in a specific folder or on a specific piece of physical media or in a specific section of a digital archive, there are the celebrity recordings that never aired, the performances that were made and set aside, the voices that went into the show and never came back out. Number. Section 15. The episodes that almost had different endings. Springfield's alternate futures. The Simpsons has always used flash-forward episodes to imagine its characters' futures. Episodes that show Bart and Lisa as adults. Episodes that show the family in a future Springfield. Episodes that speculate about what the characters would become if the floating timeline were ever allowed to resolve, if the ages were allowed to change, if Springfield were permitted to exist in a future that was genuinely different from its permanent present. These flash-forward episodes are among the most emotionally rich pieces of the show's archive. They are where the show acknowledges, directly and without comedy's usual insulating distance, the specific cost of the floating timeline, the specific loss that comes from knowing that Bart will always be 10, and Lisa will always be 8, and Maggie will always be the age she was in the pilot. The flash-forward episodes are allowed to be sad in ways the regular episodes are not. They are allowed to show the consequences of the lives the characters are living, the things that will happen to them when the permanent present finally gives way to a future, however hypothetical, that the show allows itself to imagine. And because they are allowed to be sad, because they exist outside the constraints of the regular episode's emotional register, they reveal something about the show's relationship with its own characters that the regular episodes can only gesture at. They reveal the specific vulnerability that the show normally protects through comedy, the specific truth about these people that the perpetual brightness of the Springfield present normally keeps at a safe distance. The most discussed flash-forward episode is Lisa's wedding, from the 6th season. The episode shows Lisa at approximately 23, engaged to a British man named Hugh Parkfield, planning a wedding that will take place in the future Springfield of 2010. The episode is beautifully constructed around the specific tension between Lisa's desire to escape Springfield, to marry someone cultured and sophisticated and completely unlike everything she came from, and her inability to quite let go of the family she is escaping. The episode's emotional climax is Homer's realization that he is going to lose Lisa, not through any dramatic event, but through the ordinary arithmetic of adulthood, through the simple passage of time and the specific ways that growing up requires leaving behind. Homer's response to this realization, His decision to embarrass himself at the dinner with Hugh's parents, rather than suppress who he is for the sake of Lisa's future, is one of the most genuinely moving moments in the show's history. The episode exists. It is available. It is one of the archive's most celebrated pieces. But there are other flash-forward episodes that were developed and not produced, flash-forward story ideas that were pitched in the writer's room and not pursued, specific imagined futures for the characters that were contemplated and then set aside. The show has produced multiple flash-forward episodes across its run, each imagining a different version of the character's future. The futures that were imagined and not produced, the ones that existed as pitches or outlines before they were abandoned, represent a specific kind of lost archive. They are the futures that were possible but not chosen, the futures that the show considered and then declined to show. What futures were contemplated and set aside? The public record does not give a comprehensive answer. Writers have mentioned specific story ideas in interviews that were discussed and not produced. References appear occasionally in commentary tracks to flash-forward concepts that were tried in the writer's room and not pursued. But the comprehensive archive of futures that almost were is not available. There are also the alternate endings of flash-forward episodes that were actually produced. Episodes that showed one version of the character's futures, and that could have shown other versions, different outcomes for the marriages, different careers, different relationships between the family members as they aged. The specific choices that were made in each flash-forward episode, which future to show, which outcome to select from the range of possible outcomes, are the visible pieces. The other possible futures, the ones that were not chosen, are the shadow archive of the flash-forward episodes. The alternate Springfield 20 years from now that was possible before the writer's room made its specific choices. The emotional weight of these abandoned futures is significant. The show's flash-forward episodes work because they make the permanent present feel temporary, because they allow us to imagine that the characters are heading somewhere, that the floating timeline is floating towards something even if it will never quite arrive. The abandoned alternate futures are the other places it might have been floating toward, the other versions of the characters' ultimate destinies that were possible before the specific choices were made that produced the flash-forward episodes we have seen. This is, in miniature, the largest question about the show's shadow archive. Not just what was made and set aside, but what was possible that was never made. The full range of what the show might have been, pressing against the specific shape of what it became. That range is enormous. 36 years of a show that could have gone in any direction at any moment, held together by the specific choices of specific people, writers and directors and producers and network executives and actors and animators who made decisions that cumulatively produced the specific Simpsons that exists. All the other Simpsons that could have existed are there in the shadow archive, defined by their absence from the official one. All the other flash-forwards and alternate endings and abandoned characters and cutscenes and banned episodes and international alternatives. The full range of possible Springfields, surrounding the specific Springfield that was chosen. Number. Section 16. The Simpsons that never ended. What happens to a show when it outlives its stories. There is a specific and largely undiscussed dimension of the Lost Simpsons archive that has nothing to do with episodes that were pulled, or scripts that were abandoned, or scenes that were cut. It has to do with the show's relationship with its own continuation, with the specific creative cost of running a show for 36 years, and the specific kinds of content that become unavailable when a show has been running that long. The Simpsons, in common with every long-running show, has exhausted certain categories of story. Not completely, not to the point where no new episodes can be made clearly. New episodes are still being made and aired. But in the sense that the story space available to the show has shrunk as the show has grown, certain stories have already been told. Certain character dynamics have already been explored. Certain Springfield locations have already been visited. The archive, which is the record of all the stories the show has told, is also a map of all the stories that cannot be told again without being repetitions. This is not unique to The Simpsons. Every show that runs long enough faces this problem. The specific character of the problem for The Simpsons is that the show has been running long enough that the lost stories, the stories that were possible in the early seasons and are no longer possible because they have been told, are more numerous than the remaining untold stories in certain categories. Homer discovering something about himself for the first time. Bart and Lisa experiencing a specific childhood milestone. The family facing a specific type of financial or domestic crisis. These story types were available to the show in its first season in a way that they are not available now because the show has already done them. The specific emotional weight that comes from encountering a story for the first time, the weight of genuine novelty, is not available to the show when it returns to a territory it has already mapped. The stories that were possible in 1990 and are no longer possible in 2025 because they have been told are, in a meaningful sense, lost. They are in the archive, but they are in the archive as things that have been done rather than things that can be done. The first time Homer confronted his fear of death. The first time Lisa experienced genuine social exclusion. The first time Bart showed genuine tenderness toward a member of his family. These moments exist in the archive as completed pieces of the show's emotional history. They cannot be done again with the same weight. The show has found ways to work around this problem. It tells stories in new settings, new countries, new cultural contexts, new genres. It introduces new characters to create new relationships. It explores aspects of the existing characters that have not previously been examined. It does what any long-running show does, which is to find the remaining story space and work within it as creatively as possible. But the lost story space, the space of stories that were possible and are no longer possible, is real, and it grows with every season. The archive of what the show has done is simultaneously the record of the show's history and the map of what the show can no longer do. Every season that adds to the archive also subtracts from the available story space, and that subtraction is a kind of loss that is different from any of the other kinds of loss we have discussed. This is the quietest and perhaps the most profound piece of the Shadow Archive. Not a specific episode that was pulled or a specific scene that was cut, but the accumulated effect of 36 years of storytelling on the territory available for future stories. The creative cost of a show that has been running for long enough to have told most of the stories it has to tell. The Simpsons is still running, new episodes are still being made. The show is still finding stories to tell, still finding ways to put these characters through experiences that are new, still generating the specific quality of comedy and emotion that has kept it on the air for 3.5 decades. But the available story space is smaller than it was in 1990. The archive is larger. The gap between what was possible and what is possible now is real. And it grows with every episode that is added to the official archive and subtracted from the story space. The lost Simpsons of this kind is the most invisible piece of the Shadow Archive. You cannot find it in a production vault. You cannot hear it in an unreleased recording. You cannot read it in an abandoned script. It exists only as an absence, the specific absence of stories that could have been told in one era and cannot be told now. The creative space that has been foreclosed by the show's own history. And it is enormous. 3.5 decades of stories told is 3.5 decades of story space consumed. The Shadow Archive of the untellable stories is as large as the official archive of the stories that were told, perhaps larger. Number. Section 17. The Town That Got Away. Springfield's unmapped geography and what lives there. Springfield is, famously, everywhere and nowhere. The show has been deliberately inconsistent about its location for its entire run, placing it in different states, in different episodes, giving it geographic features that are mutually contradictory, and generally treating the question of where exactly Springfield is as a joke that the show can sustain precisely because it is never fully resolved. This geographic impossibility is usually discussed as a comedy device, a way of making Springfield universal, relatable to American viewers regardless of where they actually live, by ensuring that it could be their town without actually being any specific town. And this reading is correct, as far as it goes. The show's creators have confirmed that the geographic ambiguity is intentional and that its function is exactly what this reading suggests. But the geographic ambiguity also creates something else. It creates a Springfield that exists in a specific relationship with what is not shown, with the parts of itself that are off-screen, outside the frame of any given episode, in the unmapped territories of the fictional town. The Springfield we know is the Springfield of specific locations: the power plant, the Quickie Mart, the elementary school, the town square, the Simpson house on Evergreen Terrace, Moe's Tavern, the Springfield Gorge. These are the locations that appear in episodes that have been established in the show's visual vocabulary that are legible to any viewer who has watched the show for any length of time. But Springfield is a town. It has more to it than the locations that appear in episodes. It has streets that are never shown, neighborhoods that are never visited, residents that are never depicted, histories that are never explored. The Springfield that exists in the show is a selective representation of a larger fictional entity, a sample, drawn from a population that is never fully mapped. The unmapped Springfield, the streets and neighborhoods and residents, and histories that are never shown, is part of the shadow archive in a specific way. It is the archive of what the show did not depict, which is to say the archive of everything in Springfield that is not the show. The residents who live there but never appear in episodes. The stores and restaurants and parks and buildings that exist by implication but are never shown. The specific quality of the places that are never visited. The writers of the show have built up, across 36 years of production, an extensive internal mythology about Springfield, about its history, its geography, its institutional life, its specific character as a place. Much of this mythology never makes it into episodes. It exists as background knowledge in the writer's room, as the shared understanding of the fictional world that allows the writers to make specific choices about what to include and what to leave out. This internal mythology is a piece of the shadow archive that is entirely invisible. It exists in the heads of the people who made the show, in the documents that were produced during the show's development process, in the specific decisions that were made about what Springfield was and was not. But it is not publicly available. It is not the kind of thing that gets written up in press releases or published in companion volumes to the show. The Springfield that the writers know the town as it exists in the full internal mythology of the production is larger and more detailed than the Springfield that the audience sees. The audience sees the sample. The writers know the population. And the gap between the sample and the population is the unmapped Springfield, the town that got away, that was always larger than the show could fully depict. This is again true of every fictional world. Every world that a narrative creates is larger than the narrative that creates it. The world implies more than the story shows. The characters have lives beyond the episodes that depict them. The town exists beyond the scenes that take place in it. But Springfield is a particular case because of the show's specific relationship with its own incompleteness. The show has always treated Springfield's incompleteness as a resource, as something to be played with, to be referred to be used as a comic element. The joke that Springfield is everywhere and nowhere, the joke that its geography is impossible, the joke that new locations can appear in Springfield whenever the story requires them. All of these jokes depend on the awareness that Springfield is incomplete, that it is being constructed episode by episode rather than pre-existing as a complete world. The unmapped Springfield is, in this sense, not simply a gap in the archive. It is an active element of the show's creative process. The places that are not shown are the places that can still be shown. The residents who have not appeared are the residents who can still appear. The histories that have not been explored are the histories that can still be explored. The shadow archive of Springfield's unmapped territory is also, in this sense, the show's remaining story space, the specific places and people and histories that have not yet been visited, and that therefore remain available for future episodes to explore. The two things, the lost Springfield that was possible and was not made, and the possible Springfield that might still be made are, ultimately, the same thing. They are the Springfield that exists beyond the edges of the official archive, in the space between what has been shown and what could be shown. That space is still large. 36 years of episodes have filled a great deal of it, but they have not filled all of it. The unmapped Springfield persists, and as long as the show continues, as long as new episodes are made and new corners of the town are visited for the first time, the boundary between the lost Springfield and the possible Springfield continues to shift. Number, Section 18. The Last Night in Springfield. Closing the archive. We have been in the shadow archive for a long time now. We have moved through its territories with care, pausing in the places where the story was interesting enough to slow down and stay a while. We have looked at the development footage that predates the show, the troubled pilots, the banned international episodes, the pulled domestic broadcasts, the cut scenes and the alternate endings and the abandoned scripts and the celebrity complications and the production disasters and the meta episodes and the unmade alternate futures and the unmapped geography and the exhausted story space. We have looked at all of it, or as much of it as the public record allows. And we have arrived here, at the end of the night, with the archive spread out around us, the official archive that everyone can see, and the shadow archive that most people never think about, both enormous, both real, both part of the same thing. What have we found? We have found, first, that the show is larger than it appears, that The Simpsons that exist the nearly 800 episodes that are in the official archive, the show that has been watched by more people in more countries than almost any other piece of entertainment in history, is only part of The Simpsons that was made and attempted and imagined. The shadow archive is real, and it is large, and it contains things that the audience has never had access to and may never have access to. We have found, second, that the show is not fixed, that the archive changes as the commercial and cultural context around it changes, that episodes are removed and restricted and edited in response to pressures that have nothing to do with the quality of the content, that the version of the show you can access today is not the same as the version you could have accessed 10 years ago, and is not the same as the version you will be able to access 10 years from now. The archive is alive, and it changes, and the changes are not always visible to the casual viewer. We have found, third, that the losses are of many different kinds. The loss of the development footage is different from the loss of the pulled broadcast episode, which is different from the loss of the abandoned script, which is different from the loss of the international alternative, which is different from the loss of the unmade future episode. Each kind of loss has its own specific character, its own specific relationship to what is missing and why it is missing. And the aggregate of all these different kinds of loss is an enormous and varied shadow archive that surrounds the official archive on all sides. We have found, fourth, that the losses are not always regrettable. Some of what is in the shadow archive is there because it was not good enough to be in the official archive. The abandoned script that was set aside because the story did not work, the alternate ending that was produced and discarded because a better ending was found, the character who was developed and then not included because the show did not find a use for them. These are cases where the loss is the sign of a functioning creative process doing its job. The archive is better for what was removed, but some of what is in the shadow archive is there for reasons that are not about quality. Episodes that were pulled because real-world events made them temporarily impossible to consume as entertainment. Episodes that were removed from streaming for commercial and reputational reasons. Scripts that were abandoned because of institutional pressures that had nothing to do with the quality of the story. Recordings that were never aired because of relationships that went wrong. These are cases where the loss is less clearly a sign of a healthy creative process, where something that might have been valuable was set aside for reasons that were not primarily about the work. The shadow archive contains both kinds of loss, and the two kinds are not always easy to distinguish from the outside. The abandoned script that was genuinely not working and the abandoned script that was abandoned because of a network content concern look the same from the outside, in the absence of documentation that explains the specific reason for the abandonment. The difference between them is significant, but it is not always visible. What we can say with certainty is that both kinds of loss are real, and that the shadow archive is the record of all of them together, the good decisions and the less good ones, the creative failures and the institutional pressures, the things that were genuinely not good enough and the things that were good enough but could not survive the specific conditions of the moment. The shadow archive is, in this sense, a completely honest account of what the show has been. Not the idealized version, the version where every creative decision was made purely on the basis of quality and every piece of lost content was lost because it was not good enough. The real version, where the decisions were made by real people under real conditions, shaped by the full range of pressures and considerations that shape all human creative work. The Simpsons is one of the most human pieces of entertainment ever made. It has been made by a very large number of people over a very long period of time, and those people have brought to it all the complexity and fallibility and specific situatedness that humans always bring to the things they make. The shadow archive is the evidence of that humanity, the record of all the ways the making process was complicated and imperfect, and subject to pressures that had nothing to do with the pure creative impulse that originally generated the show. You cannot fully know The Simpsons without knowing the shadow archive. Not because the shadow archive contains better or more important content than the official one, but because the shadow archive is the context within which the official one was produced. Understanding what was set aside helps you understand why what remains is the way it is. Understanding the pressures that shaped the archive helps you understand the specific shape of the archive that resulted. The show you know is the show that survived. The shadow archive is the record of everything else. And both the show that survived and the record of everything else are part of the same story. The story of 36 years of a show finding its way, making choices, accumulating history, building a world that does not exist on any map but that millions of people have found, in some specific sense, to be home. That world is still there. Springfield is still there. The family on the couch, the chalkboard, the saxophone, the power plant with the cracked cooling towers, the gorge, the quickie mart, the nuclear plant, the town square, all of it exactly as it has always been, waiting for the next episode and the one after that and the one after that. And around it, in the dark outside the picture frame, the shadow archive is there too. The pieces that were made and set aside, the stories that were attempted and not completed, the versions of Springfield that were possible but not chosen, the episodes that existed and then stopped existing, the recordings that were made and never heard, the scripts that were written and never animated, the characters who almost existed, the futures that were almost shown, the town that was always larger than any episode could fully depict. All of it together is The Simpsons, the visible and the invisible, the official and the shadow, the archive and everything that surrounds it. That is the show. That has always been the show. And knowing all of it, or knowing as much of it as the public record allows, which is to say knowing the outlines even when the details are not available, changes how the official archive feels, makes it feel specific, chosen, particular, the result of decisions that were made against the full range of what was possible. The Simpsons that exists did not have to be the way it is. It is the way it is because people made it that way. Across 36 years and hundreds of decisions and thousands of individual creative choices, each one foreclosing some possibilities and opening others, the show accumulated into the specific thing it is. That specific thing is remarkable. The specific shape of it, the texture of its comedy, the specific emotional register of its best episodes, the particular quality of the world it has built is the result of all those decisions going a certain way. Different decisions would have produced a different show. The specific show that exists is not inevitable, it is the result. And the shadow archive is the shadow of that result, the shape of everything that was set aside to produce it, the specific silhouette of all the other Simpsons that could have been, cast by the specific Simpsons that is. Feel that now, in the quiet of this night, in the comfortable dark of wherever you are watching from. The show around you in the archive, in the memory, in the specific feeling of familiarity that the show produces in people who grew up with it, and the shadow of the show alongside it, both real, both part of the same enormous thing. Let it be present. Let the full size of it be felt. The show and its shadow. The archive and the shadow archive. The Springfield that exists and the Springfield that was possible. Let it all be there, in the comfortable dark, as the night goes on and the voice gets quieter, and Springfield settles into the specific stillness that it always settles into at the end of an episode. The credits are rolling somewhere. The couch gag has played. The family is on the couch, the same family they have always been, in the same house they have always lived in the same town that has never been on any map. And the shadow archive is there too, in the dark beyond the edge of the picture. Both of them are there. Both of them are real. Good night. Wherever you are, and whatever time it is where you are watching from, good night. Springfield will be there in the morning. It always is. Number. Section 19. The voices behind the curtain. Harry Shearer and the year. The show almost lost everything. In May 2015, something happened that almost reshaped The Simpsons more dramatically than any single production decision in the show's history. Harry Shearer, the voice actor who had been with the show since its very first episode, announced that he would not be returning for the show's 27th season. He was leaving. After 26 years of voicing a list of characters that included Mr. Burns, Ned Flanders, Principal Skinner, Smithers, Kent Brockman, Lenny, Dr. Nick, and a substantial portion of Springfield's secondary male population, Shearer announced he was done. The reasons were publicly framed as contractual disagreements. Shearer indicated that he wanted greater freedom to pursue other projects, and that the contract being offered to him did not provide that freedom in the way he required. The negotiations had broken down. He was leaving. The immediate reaction within the show's fan community was something between alarm and disbelief. Shearer's characters are not peripheral figures. They are, in several cases, central to the show's identity. Mr. Burns, in particular, is essentially irreplaceable, in the specific sense that the character has been defined by Shearer's performance across 26 seasons, in a way that makes the idea of another actor taking over feel genuinely difficult to imagine. Burns without Shearer is not Burns with a different voice. It is a different character. The specific period between Shearer's announcement and the eventual resolution of the dispute, during which the production was actively preparing to proceed without him, had cast replacement voice actors for his characters, and had announced those replacements to the press, represents one of the most dramatic moments of potential loss in the show's history. The Simpsons without Shearer, with different actors voicing Burns and Flanders and Skinner and the rest, would have been a measurably different show. Not necessarily a worse show in every sense. New performers bring new qualities, and there might have been aspects of those characters that fresh voice acting would have revealed or emphasized differently. But a different show. A show that had changed in a fundamental way. The resolution came. Shearer returned. New contracts were signed. The 27th season was produced with Shearer voicing the characters he had always voiced. The crisis passed, and the show continued as though nothing had happened. But the period of the dispute, the months when it genuinely appeared that Shearer might not return, produced a specific kind of lost content. Not episodes that were made and set aside, but episodes that were being developed under the assumption of his absence, with replacement voice actors being used in production contexts, with creative decisions being made about how to handle the characters in his absence. Whatever was produced during that period, the voice recordings of replacement actors doing their first takes on Burns and Flanders and Skinner, the early episodes that were being structured around the assumption of Shearer's absence, the specific creative adaptations that were being planned for a show that would no longer have him exists in production archives as evidence of the near miss. This is a kind of lost content that is particularly interesting because it is the record of the show almost becoming something else. Not through a gradual drift across seasons, but through a specific dramatic rupture, a specific moment when the show was actively transitioning away from what it had been and towards something different. The Simpsons that would have resulted from Shearer's permanent departure is a version of the show that was almost made. It was being prepared. Voice actors were being cast. Creative decisions were being made. It came within a relatively short distance of being the actual show rather than the hypothetical show. That near-miss Simpsons, the version of the show that was prepared in the months when Shearer's departure appeared permanent, is part of the shadow archive in a very specific sense. It is not simply a road not taken. It is a road that was actively being built before it was abandoned. And the materials from that road-building process, whatever recordings and production documents and casting decisions were made during the dispute, are part of the shadow archive alongside everything else. The specific characters that Shearer voices are also worth dwelling on in this context. Mr. Burns is, in many ways, the most important character in the show outside the Simpson family itself. He is the structural center of the show's moral universe, the figure who represents unchecked power, who stands at the intersection of all the show's themes about wealth and corruption and institutional dysfunction. Without Shearer's specific performance, Burns would not be the character he is. The specific quality of Shearer's Burns, the particular combination of menace and senility and moments of unexpected vulnerability that Shearer has found in the character across 3 decades, is not simply a set of vocal characteristics that can be transferred to another actor. It is the product of 30 years of performance, of 30 years of finding and refining and deepening the character's specific qualities. No replacement actor, however talented, could have produced the same character. They would have produced their character, which would have been different. The Burns that might have been, voiced by whoever the production cast to replace Shearer, would have been a different Burns, a different center of gravity for the show's moral universe. The implications of that difference would have cascaded through the show in ways that are genuinely difficult to calculate. That counterfactual Burns, the Burns of the show, that almost is the shadow of the Burns that exists. And knowing that it was nearly real, that it was being actively prepared before the dispute was resolved, gives the existing Burns a specific quality of contingency. He is not inevitable. He is the Burns that survived the crisis. The Burns that was preserved by the resolution of a contractual dispute that could have gone the other way. Number. Section 20. The music that disappeared when licenses lapse and scenes change. There is a category of loss in The Simpsons archive that most fans never think about because it is almost completely invisible. You have to have seen an episode in its original broadcast form and then watched it again on a streaming platform or DVD to notice it, and even then you have to be paying careful attention to music. The Simpsons has used licensed music throughout its run. Songs chosen for specific scenes because they served the moment, because the specific piece of music amplified the emotion or completed the joke or gave the scene a quality that no original composition could have matched. These licensed songs were cleared for original broadcast, which means the production obtained the right to use them in that specific context and paid the rights holder accordingly. But a license for original broadcast is not the same as a license for all subsequent uses. The rights for DVD home media release are negotiated separately. The rights for streaming are negotiated separately again. In some cases, the original rights holders, publishers, estates, musicians themselves are willing to extend their licenses to new formats at reasonable costs. In other cases, they are not. In other cases still, the rights holders cannot be found, or have changed, or have entered into relationships with other parties that complicate the licensing. When a license cannot be obtained or renewed, the production faces a choice. The scene can be removed from the episode entirely, which changes the episode's structure. The licensed music can be replaced with an original composition or a different piece of licensed music, which changes the scene's specific quality but preserves its structure. Or the episode can simply not be released in the new format, which removes it from the archive entirely. Most often, the production chooses replacement. A scene that was scored with a specific piece of licensed music in the original broadcast is rescored with something different for the home media or streaming release. The changes made. The episode goes out in the new format with new music. These changes are real and documented. Fans who have compared original broadcast recordings with DVD and streaming versions of specific episodes have cataloged a significant number of music substitutions across the show's history. The substitute music is usually similar in feel to the original. It serves the same function in the scene, but it is not the original, and the difference is audible to careful listeners. In cases where the licensed music was particularly carefully chosen, where the specific associations of a particular song were essential to the comedy or the emotional effect of the scene, the substitution represents a genuine change in the episode's character. The scene still functions, but it functions differently. The specific quality that the original music gave it is gone, replaced by something that approximates it but does not replicate it. There are scenes in the Simpsons archive that, in their streaming or DVD form, are measurably different from the scenes that were broadcast in their original form, because the specific music that was part of those scenes has been removed. The words, the animation, the story context are identical, but the music is different, and the music was part of the scene. The original broadcast versions of these scenes are, in a meaningful sense, lost. You can hear them only if you have a recording of the original broadcast, a VHS tape, a DVD of the Australian release that used different music, some other format that preserved the original broadcast content. Through the normal commercial channels by which most people now access the show, you cannot hear them. This is a quiet, invisible, unglamorous form of loss. It does not have the drama of an episode being pulled from streaming over a celebrity controversy. It does not have the historical weight of an episode being withheld after a national tragedy. It is simply the ordinary commercial reality of music licensing in the era of digital distribution, producing results that change the specific texture of specific scenes in ways that most viewers never notice. But it is real, and it is ongoing. Every time a streaming platform updates its content catalog, there is the possibility that a music license has changed, that a scene which was previously available in its original form is now available only in a revised form with substituted music. The archive is not static. It changes, and among the things that change are the specific musical choices that gave specific scenes their original character. The collection of original broadcast recordings that would let you hear all the scenes as they were first aired, all the licensed music that has since been replaced in home media and streaming releases, is not commercially available. It exists, in fragmentary form, in the private collections of fans who recorded specific broadcasts at specific times. It exists in the broadcast archives of television stations that have preserved their transmission records. It exists in whatever production materials were kept by the show's production companies. But for most viewers, the original music of many scenes is simply gone, replaced by something similar but not the same. The scenes exist, but the specific version of those scenes that originally aired with the specific music that was chosen for them is no longer available through any normal channel. Number. Section 21. Drifting Off in Springfield. A final meditation on what we keep and what we lose. It is very late now, or very early, depending on where you are and when you started listening. The night is at its deepest point, the hour when things become quiet in a way that is different from the quiet of evening, a quality of stillness that belongs specifically to the small hours. And Springfield is there with you. It has been there all night, in the background of everything we have been discussing. The town that everyone knows, the family on the couch, the chalkboard, the saxophone, the power plant, the gorge, the streets that lead everywhere and nowhere, in a geography that has never been fully mapped because the point was never to map it but to live in it, to return to it week after week for 36 years and find it exactly as you left it, exactly as comfortable and familiar and slightly wrong as it has always been. We have spent this night looking at what surrounds Springfield, at the shadow archive that presses against the visible town from all sides, at all the pieces of the show that were made and set aside, attempted and not completed, broadcast and then removed, possible but not chosen. And what we have found is that the shadow archive is not a threat to Springfield. It does not diminish it. It does not make it less real or less meaningful or less worth returning to. It is simply the context in which Springfield exists, the full, complicated human context of a piece of media that was made by people over a very long time, and that bears all the marks of that making. The episodes you love are the episodes that survived. They survived because the people who made them made choices, good choices, mostly, made in the service of making something that would be worth watching. The shadow archive is what those choices were made against. The full range of what was possible, from which the specific thing that exists was drawn. Understanding the shadow archive makes the official archive feel more real, not less. It makes the episodes feel chosen, specific, particular, the result of actual decisions made by actual people, rather than things that simply appeared, fully formed, without process or difficulty or loss. The Lost Simpsons is not a tragedy. It is a production history. The natural accumulation of 36 years of making something very large, very complex, and very human. The shadow archive is the evidence that the show was made by people who tried things and failed, who changed their minds, who were subject to pressures from outside as well as inside, who produced more than they could use, and who had to make choices about what to keep and what to set aside. All of that is the show. All of it is Springfield, the visible and the invisible, the official and the shadow, the episodes that exist and the episodes that could have existed. And now it is very late, or very early, and Springfield is settling into the specific stillness of the end of an episode. The credits are rolling somewhere. The couch gag has played. The family is on the couch, the same family they have always been, in the same house, in the town that has always been everywhere and nowhere. The shadow archive is there too, in the dark beyond the picture frame, the lost episodes, the pulled scenes, the abandoned scripts, the alternate versions, all quiet now, all very still. Let them be present, in that specific way that the knowledge of large invisible things is present, felt more than seen, known rather than observed, part of the texture of the night around you without being quite visible in any specific direction. Springfield will be there in the morning, the archive will be there, and the shadow archive will be there too, in the dark outside the edges of the picture, exactly where it has always been. Sleep now. Number. Section 22. The Simpsons and Real Death episodes made in the shadow of loss. Every long-running show eventually has to reckon with the deaths of the people who made it. Actors die. Writers die. Directors die. The people whose specific contributions made the show what it is leave the production permanently, through no choice of anyone involved, and the production has to find a way to continue without them. The Simpsons, having been running for 36 years, has lost a significant number of people. Performers who voiced characters that are still in the show. Writers who shaped the show's voice in its formative years. Production staff whose contributions were invisible to the audience but essential to the work. The show has accumulated a roster of losses that is, simply by virtue of having been running for so long, substantial. The specific creative challenges posed by these losses vary depending on who was lost and what they contributed. The loss of a performer who voiced a single minor character produces a different challenge than the loss of a performer who voiced multiple major recurring characters across decades. The loss of a writer who contributed to the show's early seasons produces a different challenge than the loss of a showrunner who was actively shaping the show at the moment of their death. But in every case, the loss produces a specific kind of content gap. The episodes that would have been made with that person's contribution, which now cannot be made with that contribution because the person is not there to make it. The specific quality that person brought to the show, which is now absent from the show and cannot be replaced. Phil Hartman's death in 1998 created the most significant and most publicly discussed content gap of this kind. The characters he voiced, Lionel Hutz and Troy McClure, were retired from the show rather than recast, and the episodes that would have continued to feature those characters were simply not made. The Lionel Hutz episodes that would have been made across the subsequent 26 seasons of the show are a large body of lost content. The Troy McClure episodes similarly. These are not episodes that were made and set aside. They are episodes that were never made, because the person whose performance was essential to making them was no longer there. The decision not to recast was, in the specific circumstances, the right one. But it produced a loss that accumulated over time every subsequent season in which Hutz or McClure would have appeared in the regular rotation of Springfield's recurring characters, but did not, because the show had decided they could not continue without Hartman. Jack Burns, who voiced various minor characters across the show's run, died in 2020. Marsha Wallace, the voice of Mrs. Krabappel, died in 2013 after a long association with the show. The show's response to Wallace's death was to retire Mrs. Krabappel with a specific and quite moving tribute, an episode dedicated to her memory, an acknowledgement within the show of the character's absence, a genuine act of mourning within the fictional world for the person who had brought the character to life. The episodes that could have continued to feature Mrs. Krabappel, the ongoing life of the character within Springfield, are a different kind of lost content from the Hartman cases. Where Hutz and McClure were simply absent from subsequent episodes without acknowledgement, Mrs. Krabappel's absence was marked. The show said goodbye to the character and, through the character, to the actress. But the goodbye is also a foreclosure. The Mrs. Krabappel stories that could have been told in subsequent seasons, the character's ongoing role in Bart's education and in Springfield's social ecology are not available. The tribute episode closed the character's arc definitively, which was the right creative response to the loss, but which also means those stories cannot be told. The relationship between loss and the Shadow Archive is, in these cases, the most profound of all the relationships we have been discussing. The other pieces of the Shadow Archive are there because of decisions, choices that were made and could have been made differently. The content gap created by the deaths of the people who made the show is there because of something that was not a choice at all. It is the most unavoidable kind of loss, the one that cannot be reversed by a different decision or recovered from a production vault. The Simpsons that was not made because Phil Hartman died, the hundreds of episodes that would have featured Hutz and McClure across 26 years, is the largest single piece of the Shadow Archive in terms of sheer volume of unmade content. And it is there not because anyone chose it to be there, but because a man died in a terrible and completely random way in 1998, and the show, rightly, decided not to pretend otherwise. The Shadow Archive of Loss is the most human piece of the show's history. It is the place where the show's fiction meets the irreversible reality of the people who made it. The place where Springfield is revealed, most starkly, as something that was created and maintained by people who were mortal, who were living their own lives alongside the fictional lives of The Simpsons, and who are no longer here to continue. The Simpsons has always been about family, about the specific experience of living with people you love and being shaped by them and sometimes losing them. The Shadow Archive of the people who made it is the show's own experience of that same theme, the loss of the people who gave it life, and the specific shape of the absence they left behind. Number, Section 23. The long silence before the next episode. What happens between seasons? The production rhythm of The Simpsons creates a specific kind of silence between seasons. The regular season ends, the final episode airs, and then there is a gap, a period of weeks or months, during which the show is not on the air, during which the production is simultaneously completing the final pieces of the concluded season and beginning the development work for the next one. This gap is, for most viewers, invisible. The show cycles in syndication year-round, so there is always a Simpsons episode available somewhere even when the new season is not airing. The sense of a gap of the show being between seasons, of there being a period when new Simpsons content is not being produced, is only felt by viewers who are following the show's production schedule closely. But within the production itself, the interseason gap is real and significant. It is the period when the writer's room is most active in generating new story ideas, when the creative direction for the upcoming season is being established, when decisions are being made about which characters will be featured and which storylines will be developed, and which directions the show will take in the coming year. The content generated during this period, the pitches, the outlines, the early drafts, the story discussions, is among the most ephemeral pieces of the shadow archive. It exists, if it exists in any recoverable form, in the notes and documents produced during the development process. Some of it will eventually become episodes. Much of it will not. The inter-season development process is where the most speculative and ambitious story ideas are often generated, because the pressure of the current production cycle has temporarily lifted, and the writers have more freedom to think expansively about what the next season could be. Ideas that would be dismissed as too ambitious or too complex during the regular production season may get more serious consideration during the inter-season period, when there is more time to think through the implications. Some of these ambitious ideas become episodes. Some are scaled back into less ambitious versions that fit the regular production constraints better. Some are noted for future consideration and then lost in the press of the next season's work. Some are discussed extensively and then simply not pursued. The inter-season development process is, across 36 years of the show, an enormous generator of story material that never became episodes. The ideas that were generated and not pursued, the ambitious story directions that were considered and then scaled back or abandoned, the creative conversations that shaped the season without producing any specific episode, all of this is the shadow archive of the development process. It is also, notably, the most completely invisible piece of the shadow archive. Development conversations leave no publicly accessible trace. The notes from a development meeting exist in someone's personal records or in the production company's files, but they are not the kind of thing that ends up in DVD special features or retrospective interviews. They are too raw, too tentative, too much a part of the working process to be presented to the public. The gap between seasons is, in this sense, a period when the shadow archive is being actively generated, when more is being considered than will ever be produced, when the range of possible future Simpsons is at its widest before the constraints of the production cycle, narrow it back down to what is achievable within the specific conditions of the next 22 episodes. There is something beautiful about this, in a strange way. The moment of maximum possibility for The Simpsons, the moment when the most futures are simultaneously available, is the moment when the show is not on the air. The inter-season gap, the long silence between the end of one season and the beginning of the next, is when Springfield is most fully alive with potential, when the range of things it could become is widest, when the shadow archive of unmade episodes is being most actively generated. And then the season begins. The production pipeline opens. The story possibilities narrow toward the specific episodes that will be made. The shadow archive grows with everything that is generated and not chosen, and the official archive grows with everything that is chosen and produced. And by the time the season ends, the range of possibilities has narrowed from everything to the specific 22 episodes that constitute the new season. This cycle, expansion and contraction, possibility and realization, the wide open space of development and the specific constraint of production, has been running for 36 years. And the accumulated product of all those cycles is the official archive, surrounded by the enormous shadow archive of everything that was generated and not chosen in each cycle. Section 24. Letters never sent, the fan connection and the episodes that responded to the audience. The Simpsons has always had an unusual relationship with its audience. The show was, from its earliest seasons, extraordinarily popular, not in the slow-building way that some shows accumulate audiences over time, but immediately and dramatically popular in a way that put it at the center of American cultural conversation within its first season. That popularity generated a specific kind of audience relationship. People wrote to the show. They wrote in large numbers, with opinions and suggestions and questions and expressions of love and criticism. The production received fan mail at a volume that was unusual even for a network hit. And within the production, there were ongoing conversations about how to understand and respond to that audience relationship. The specific audience responses that influenced the show's direction, the fan reactions that caused the production to reconsider something, or to lean further into something, or to try something different, are a piece of the show's history that is mostly undocumented. The production has not systematically shared accounts of how audience response shaped creative decisions. Individual writers have occasionally mentioned in interviews that audience reaction to a specific episode or character influenced subsequent story choices. But the full account of the show's audience relationship and its influence on the show's content is not available. What is documented, in a fragmentary way, is that the audience's relationship with specific characters influenced those characters' trajectories. The audience's affection for Ned Flanders, which was, in the earliest seasons, more than the writers had anticipated, influenced how the character was developed in subsequent seasons. The audience's specific reaction to certain Homer storylines influenced how Homer's character was handled going forward. The specific ways in which the audience engaged with the show's comedy affected, over time, the specific directions the comedy took. But there were also cases where the audience relationship pushed in directions that the production chose not to follow. Audience requests that were considered and declined. Fan theories that the writers were aware of and chose not to confirm or deny. Specific requests from dedicated fans that the production noted and then did not act on. The fan mail that the production received and did not respond to creatively. The audience suggestions that were read and not incorporated is a specific kind of shadow archive. Not of content that was made and set aside, but of creative directions that were proposed from outside the production and not adopted. The fans who wrote those letters, who sent those suggestions, who asked for specific stories or specific character directions or specific moments that never appeared in any episode, they were engaging with a version of the show that existed in their imagination alongside the official version, a version of Springfield that was shaped by their own desires and expectations and creative instincts. And that version, which was never made because the production never responded to it in the specific way the fan hoped for, is a piece of the show's shadow archive too. The audience's imagined Simpsons the version of the show that exists in the minds of millions of fans, shaped by what they love about the official version and inflected by what they wish it had done differently, is the largest piece of the shadow archive. It is not recoverable. It is distributed across the minds of everyone who has ever watched the show and formed an opinion about what it should do next, or what it should have done differently, or what it missed. It is the sum of all the imagined Springfields that the official Springfield has generated. That aggregate imagined Springfield is immense. It is larger than anything we have discussed tonight. It contains every fan theory ever proposed, every piece of fan fiction ever written, every conversation ever held between people who love the show about what they wish the show would do. It is the show at its widest extension, the full range of what the show has meant to the people who have watched it, which goes far beyond what the show itself has ever shown. This is the final piece of the shadow archive, the piece that cannot be located in any production vault or broadcast archive. The piece that lives in the minds of the audience rather than in the records of the production. The imagined Simpsons, distributed across millions of viewers, as real in their experience of the show as any episode that was actually made. Springfield exists there too, in the imagination of everyone who has ever loved the show, in the specific version of Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie that each viewer carries with them, shaped by the official episodes and by all the ways the viewer has interpreted and extended and made personal what the show gave them. That Springfield is yours. It has always been yours. It is the Springfield you built from the pieces the show gave you, shaped by your specific life and your specific experience of watching it, inflected by whatever the show has meant to you across however many years you have been watching it. It is the most personal piece of the shadow archive, and it is the one that is most completely lost, in the sense that it exists only in you, and when you are gone it will be gone too, and nobody will ever be able to reconstruct exactly what Springfield looked like in your imagination at the specific moment when the show was most alive for you. Hold on to that, Springfield. It is real. It is yours. And it is part of the same enormous thing that we have been moving through all night, the official archive and the shadow archive and the imagined archive and the impossible lost archive of the show as it existed in every mind that has ever encountered it. All of it is The Simpsons. All of it is Springfield. And all of it is here, in this quiet night, with you. Number section 25. Every couch, every gag, the archive of small moments. If you have watched The Simpsons for any length of time, you have noticed the couch gag. The moment at the end of the opening credits sequence where the family races home and sits on the couch, and where something happens, something different every time, Something that has ranged in the course of the show's history from a simple sight gag to an elaborate piece of short animation that is more ambitious than most of what follows it in the episode proper. The couch gag has been running since the show's first episode. It has changed with almost every episode across 36 seasons. That means there have been hundreds of couch gags, hundreds of individual pieces of short animation, each one different, each one a small exercise in whatever kind of creativity the writers and directors and animators brought to the specific problem of what happens when the Simpson family sits on the couch this week. The couch gag has been used to introduce guest animators from studios around the world. Bill Plimpton did one, Sylvain Chomet did one, Don Hertzfeldt did one. Banksy staged an elaborate piece of dark commentary on the show's own production process through a couch gag that became one of the most widely discussed pieces of animation the show has produced in its later seasons. The couch gag has been used to break from the show's visual style entirely, to do things in different animation languages, to make jokes about the show itself and about the medium and about the experience of watching. It is, in miniature, the most creatively experimental corner of the show, the place where risk is most tolerated, where the expectations are most open, where the thing that happens can be anything. And across 36 seasons of that creative freedom, there are couch gags that were produced and not used. Gags that were animated and then swapped out at the last minute for something that worked better with a specific episode. Gags that were produced for time budgets that changed between production and broadcast. Gags that existed in completed form and then were replaced by other completed gags for reasons that were never publicly explained. These unused couch gags are, in their way, the most charming piece of the Shadow archive. They are short, they are self-contained. They do not carry the weight of a pulled episode or an abandoned script. But they are there, in the production archive, representing small exercises in creative freedom that were made and then not used. There is something worth sitting with in the image of an unused couch gag, fully animated, fully produced, ready to be seen, and then not seen, because a different version was used instead. The couch gag sitting in the archive, waiting for an episode that never came. It is the smallest possible piece of the Shadow archive, and in its smallness, in the simple fact of a few seconds of animation that was made and then not broadcast, it captures something true about the nature of the archive itself. All the things that were made and not shown. All the small exercises in creativity that existed and then were set aside. The accumulation of all those small moments of production that did not make it into the final product. The Shadow archive is not just the big dramatic cases, the pulled episodes and the abandoned scripts and the banned international versions. It is also the unused couch gags, the alternate takes, the early drafts, the good ideas that were not quite good enough, the good ideas that were very good but that there was no room for. All the small pieces of production that accumulated, across 36 years, into an enormous parallel record of everything the show tried that the show did not ultimately use. That parallel record is there, quiet, mostly unrecoverable, the small moments alongside the large ones. The couch gags that nobody saw, the takes that were recorded and set aside, the drafts that were written and not finished, the characters that were imagined and not drawn, the music that played in one version of a scene and not in the version that aired, all of it together is the shadow of Springfield, the shadow that the show casts as it moves through time, made up of everything it tried and set aside, everything it was before it became what it finally was. Let that shadow be present with you now. In this specific quiet, in the specific hour of this specific night. The town and its shadow. The archive and the Shadow archive. The Springfield you know and all the other Springfields that were possible. All of them are there. All of them are real. And the one you know, the one that survived all the decisions, that made it through all the production processes and all the commercial pressures and all the cultural collisions and all the years that one is there most of all. Warm and specific and particular and yours. That is Springfield. That is the show. That is the family on the couch. Good night. Number, section 26. The weight of 36 years. There is a specific quality to things that have existed for a very long time. A weight, a density, a specific kind of presence that comes from having accumulated enough history to be genuinely historical. The Simpsons has been running for 36 years. By the standards of most human institutions, most businesses, most governments, most organizations of any kind, 36 years is a significant period of time. By the standards of television, it is extraordinary. By the standards of animated entertainment, it is unprecedented. The show that began in December 1989 has outlasted the career of every major politician who was in office when it debuted. It has outlasted most of the corporations that were advertising during its first season. It has outlasted the networks that existed when it started, or at least outlasted those networks' original identities, as the media industry has consolidated and transformed around it. It has outlasted the specific cultural moment that produced it, the late Reagan era, the beginning of the period of American cultural confidence that would persist through the 1990s before giving way to the anxieties of the 21st century. The show has watched, in its 36 years, an enormous amount of American history. It was on the air when the Soviet Union fell. It was on the air through the Gulf War. It was on the air through the Clinton era and the Bush era and the Obama era and the Trump era and beyond. It was on the air when the internet was a novelty and when it became infrastructure and when the specific nature of that infrastructure began to reshape how media itself was made and distributed and consumed. All of that history is embedded in the show, not just in the specific cultural references that mark episodes as belonging to particular moments, but in the specific quality of attention the show brought to each moment it was produced in. The late 1980s episodes have a quality that is specific to that moment. The mid-1990s Golden Age episodes have a different quality. The early 2000s episodes have a different quality still. And the episodes of the show's current era reflect the specific conditions of the current moment in ways that the earliest episodes could not have anticipated. The show is a record of 36 years of American cultural life. Not a systematic record, not an objective one, not a record that could serve as primary source material in any strict historical sense. But a record nonetheless, the specific way that a particular group of very talented writers, working within a specific institutional context, processed and reflected and satirized the world they were living in, week by week, for 36 years. The shadow archive of that record is the evidence of everything that was processed and reflected and satirized that did not make it into the official episodes. All the things that were tried and not used. All the stories that were started and not finished. All the versions of American life that were observed and noted and then set aside because there was not room for them, or because they were not ready, or because something changed between the observation and the broadcast that made the story no longer available. That shadow record is enormous. 36 years of trying to understand and represent American life generates more material than 36 years of episodes can contain. The excess is the shadow archive. Everything that was seen and noted and not used. Everything that was too raw or too political or too specifically tied to a moment that passed before the episode could air. Everything that was observed and not quite captured in the specific form that broadcast comedy required. The Simpsons is one of the best records we have of what American life felt like across those 36 years. And the shadow archive is the record of what the show could not quite say, or chose not to say, or was prevented from saying, or could see but not yet fully articulate. The residue of the things that were too true, or not true enough, or true in a way that the specific format of a 22-minute animated comedy could not adequately hold. All of that is there too, in the dark alongside the episodes, you know. And it is very late now, or very early, the hour when the specific quality of night changes, when the darkness has a different texture, when the world is most quiet and the mind is most open to the things that are usually too subtle to register. Springfield is there, the shadow archive is there, the enormous weight of 36 years of making something and trying to make it well, and succeeding and failing in the specific ways that all human creative work succeeds and fails, and continuing anyway, and producing the show that millions of people have watched and loved and carried with them through their own 36 years of living. That show, that weight, that shadow, all here with you now, in this particular quiet. Let it be present as you drift toward sleep. Let the full size of the thing be felt, gently, without alarm. The archive and the shadow archive and the imagined archive and the lost archive. The Springfield that exists, and the Springfield that was possible, and the Springfield that lives in the minds of everyone who has ever loved it. All of it together is The Simpsons. All of it is real. And all of it is here, in this night, with you. As the clock moves past whatever hour it is and the world gets quieter and Springfield settles into the specific stillness that it settles into at the end of every episode. Good night, Springfield. Good night. Number closing. What the dark holds. There is a specific feeling that comes from spending a long time with something you love with the full history of something that has mattered to you across the years, sitting in the dark and turning it over and looking at all its sides? Not just the parts that are polished and presented, but the parts that are rough, the parts that are incomplete, the parts that are there because of accidents and pressures and decisions made under conditions that were not always ideal. That feeling is not sadness, exactly. It is something more specific than sadness. It is the feeling of knowing a thing completely, of having seen its shadow alongside its light, its history alongside its present, its losses alongside its survivals. The feeling of understanding the full size of something and finding that the full size is larger and stranger and more human than you knew. The Simpsons is larger and stranger and more human than you knew. That is what the Shadow Archive tells you. The show is not simply the episodes that are available on whatever platform you watch it on. It is those episodes and everything that surrounds them, the development history and the production disasters and the banned international versions and the pulled broadcasts and the cut scenes and the abandoned scripts and the lost performances and the unmade futures and the unmapped geography and the imagined Springfield that lives in every viewer's mind. All of that is the show. The full show. The show as it actually exists in the world, not the idealized version, not the version as it is marketed and presented, but the real version, made by real people under real conditions, shaped by everything that real things are shaped by. And that real version is worth knowing, worth spending a night with, worth letting settle into you in the specific way that large things settle into you when you are quiet enough to receive them. You know more about The Simpsons now than you did when the night began. You know about the Shadow Archive. You know about the gaps and the losses and the near misses and the alternatives. You know about all the other Springfields that were possible, surrounding the one Springfield that is. Take that knowledge with you, not as an anxiety, not as a sense of loss, but as a richer understanding of the thing you love. The show you know is real and it is good, and it has given something genuine to the people who watched it across 36 years. And it is also surrounded by its shadow, by all the history of its making, by all the decisions and accidents and pressures and losses that shaped it into what it is. Both things are true. The show is good, the shadow is real. And knowing both makes the whole thing feel more alive, more specific, more chosen, more genuinely the product of human effort under human conditions. That is what the dark holds, the shadow alongside the light, the archive alongside the shadow archive, the Springfield you know alongside all the Springfields that were possible. All of it is there, in the dark, waiting to be felt. Good night, sleep well. The show will be there in the morning, the archive will be there, Springfield will be there. And the shadow archive will be there too, in the dark outside the edges of the picture, exactly where it has always been. Both real, both part of the same enormous, strange, human thing. Good night.